the Global Market Advisory Committee meeting. As the designated federal officer, it is my pleasure to call this meeting. We're very much looking forward to today's presentations and discussions. I just want to go through a couple of logistical items before we start. Please ensure that your microphone is on before you speak, and that's done just by simply pressing the button. When you speak, please speak clearly into the microphone. This will allow both the webcast audience and those participating by phone to hear you. In addition, if you'd like to be recognized during the discussion, please change the position of your name tent so that it sits vertically on the table in front of you. The chair of the meeting will recognize you and give you the floor. I'd like to turn it over now to the GMAC sponsor, Commissioner Stump, who will give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Andre. Good morning. Welcome to our second GMAC 2019. I want to begin by welcoming Chairman Tarbert. It's quite appropriate given his background in international matters that his first advisory committee meeting as chairman of the CFTC has a global focus, and we're thrilled that he's here. Very fortunate to have his here at the CFTC. I also want to thank Commissioners Quintens and Benham for being here today, as well as Commissioner Berkovitz for his engagement via webcast. I know that your contribution to the discussion will be appreciated by all of the participants. I also want to thank all of the members of GMAC for making an effort to be here both in person and on the telephone, and to the panelists for all of their efforts in putting together the presentations. I know it's no small task. We're very appreciative of your participation. And lastly, I want to thank the designated federal officer for GMAC, Andre Goldsmith, for all of her efforts and her energy and her attention to all of the details for this meeting. It's greatly appreciated. At the GMAC meeting in April, we covered a wide variety of issues that made up the key pillars of the 2009 Group of 20 Leaders Directive regarding the OTC derivatives markets. My goal today is to use that discussion as a jumping off point for today's agenda. Specifically, today's presentations will delve deeper into two specific topics that we touched on in April. One, the global process applied to implementing initial margin for centrally cleared derivatives, for non-centrally cleared derivatives, and how the phasing of such has progressed, and how clearing through central counterparties has evolved since the crisis. Regarding clearing, we will specifically discuss European legislation known as EMIR 2.2 as it relates to non-EU-based central counterparties, including those under CFTC registration. Regarding the exchange of initial margin for non-centrally cleared derivatives, now is a good time to step back and reflect on the past implementation and to explore in more detail issues faced by market participants who have or will in the future phase become subject to requirements. This exercise is important in my view in order to understand whether there are actions that we as regulators can take to mitigate the potential compliance bottleneck caused by an unprecedented number of market participants coming into scope in the last implementation. First, we will hear an update from the regulator. Mike Gibson from the Division of Supervision and Regulation at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System will talk about actions regulators have taken with respect to the margin. In a timely development, several regulators voted on a joint notice of proposed rulemaking last week that would amend certain aspects of their swap margin rule. Mike will update us on those amendments, and then Rafael Martinez will update the CFTC's rule, including a staff advisory issued in July in support of the BCBS IOSC update from earlier in the year, which clarified that documentation requirements for uncleared swaps would not apply until a firm exceeds $50 million IM threshold. Next, we will hear from buy-side market participants. Richard Grant from AQR Capital Management from Goldman Sachs Asset Management will discuss some of the challenges and the preparations their firms have undertaken to prepare for upcoming. Among the issues Richard and Wendy will touch on are those involving separately managed accounts, seeded investment funds, eligible collateral, and documentation. The third panel on uncleared margin will feature Dominic Falco from BNY Mellon and Judson Baker from Northern Trust. The two panelists represent custodian banks tasked with holding initial margin for non-centrally cleared derivatives. They will discuss their experience engaging with market participants in the earlier phases of implementation and what they are doing to prepare for the unique challenges of later implementation phases. The custodian's perspective is one that we don't often hear here at the CFTC, and I'm looking forward to learning more from Dominic and Judson on how they're managing the documentation operational challenge. Lastly, Tara Cruz from ISDA will present on some of the differences across jurisdictions that have evolved relative to regulatory implementation of uncleared margin rules. Jurisdictional differences in key areas such as settlement timeframes and eligible collateral present challenges for market participants. After lunch, we will turn our focus to clear derivative space and how regulation of global central counterparties has evolved. Specifically, Sean Downey from the CME Group, Carolyn Vanden Dielen from ICE Clear Europe, and Jackie Mesa from the FIA will present on the provisions of EMIR 2.2 that affect non-EU-based CCPs and ESMA's related draft technical advice and consultation report. EMIR 2.2 materially changes the regulatory framework for non-EU-based CCPs, particularly when those CCPs are determined to be systemic important to the EU or one of its members. I believe that it's important that we fully understand the proposed changes and how they might affect our own registered derivatives clearing organization. Sean, Carolyn, and Jackie will present on the specifics of ESMA's consultation papers in tiering criteria and incomparable compliance, including their reactions to the ESMA's proposals. I'm looking forward to digging deeper into some of the topics we covered more generally in the April meeting. And I again want to recognize the tremendous amount of work and time that's gone into preparing for this.
Chairman Tarbert.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Stump, for convening this meeting. Thank you to all of you for being here. I see many faces that I've known throughout my time here at CFTC, all 60-plus days, as well as in my various former roles at the U.S. Treasury and even in the private sector prior to that. So it's great to have you all. Andre, thank you so much for your work in making this possible. We've got two big ticket items today, right? We've got margin requirements and the phase-in of Phase 5. And this is really important because we're literally going from about 40 covered entities to over 700. And in that 700, we expect that we could see the operationalizing of about 7,000 initial margin relationships when we move to Phase 5. So it's really important that I think we take the time to get it right. We understand the insights from our fellow regulators at the Fed, as well as from all of you that are affected. I will note that the banking regulators on September 17th extended the compliance period for 1 year. I can tell everybody today that our staff has been working on a proposal to amend the corresponding deadline for our rules, and it's my hope that the Commission will vote in the near future on whether to issue the proposal. Other big ticket item, obviously, is EMIR 2.2, and this, I know this advisory committee has spoken to this issue in the past, and your views have been really important in helping us understand the issue better and working on the dialogue with our European counterparts. Obviously, CCPs are really important. Many of them are systemically important, and we fully understand that every financial system has to think about systemic risks that it faces, whether that risk comes from inside the system or potentially outside the system. I think our view is that at present, none of our CCPs in the United States, based in the United States, pose systemic risk outside the United States, and certainly not to Europe. But nonetheless, we understand the reasons why EMIR 2.2 has been brought to the fore to deal primarily with the Brexit situation. And what we want to do is make sure that we don't end up in a place where we have, again, by inadvertent regulatory moves, market fragmentation, contradictory rules, and even potentially increasing systemic risk here in the United States. So to that end, we've started the dialogue with the European Commission under my chairmanship as well as ESMA. We've had one very good meeting where we had the opportunity to talk more about deference, to really truly understand their concerns. And so we're hopeful that over time we will be able to address any concerns they have while also reaffirming the concerns that we have in getting to a place where we've got global cooperation. So we very much look forward to your views in that regard, ways that we can continue on that path to reach a mutually beneficial solution. Thank you.
Commissioner Quinten.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Commissioner Stump, for your leadership, GMAC, for the important agenda today. Thank you, Andre, for your hard work. Thank you, Angie, for let me just quickly echo the comments of both Commissioner Stump and Chairman Tarbert. These are two very important issues. I think a lot of sense to continue to discuss them publicly. The uncleared margin rules have, I think, show the problems with using notional value. They show the problems when regulations are not calibrated to the risk and when cost-benefit analysis is inadequate. Hopefully, we will continue to move away from using notional value and regulatory rules that impose costs without relation to risk, because I think we have been dealing with the negative impacts of those decisions for quite some time now. I'm very pleased that we are taking action to try to resolve some of them, but I think it's important that we also acknowledge this should be the end of that type of consideration. I'm very grateful to the chairman and his leadership and look forward to considering any action that the commission can take to alleviate the burden and to provide more compliance time or to recalibrate those rules. On EMIR 2.2, let me just say that I think we're all well aware of the tiering proposal, and I think it's important to acknowledge this is not a exercise in big data analytics where thousands or millions of data points are run through some type of tiering or sorting algorithm to arrive at an unknown result. I believe it's impossible to develop this proposal and to calibrate this framework without knowing the result. Therefore, I think the earlier that we all receive clarity on what those results are, the more likely it is we can avoid very negative consequences and outcomes that have yet to be taken off the table. So let me commend again the GMAC for addressing these very important issues. I look forward to hearing all of them.
Commissioner Benham.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Good to see all of you. First off, thanks to Commissioner Stump, Andre, and Angie, of course, for leadership, and Chairman and Commissioner Quintens. Just reiterate what everyone said already. Very important issues. Look forward to hearing from everyone. And I do appreciate and acknowledge both Chairman Tarbert and Commissioner Stump's leadership on these a lot of very difficult questions to sort of unpack. Have a lot of big consequences. So look forward to the committee's deliberation and any recommendations, and thank you.
I'll now turn it over to Angie to keep the agenda.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman, Commissioner Stump, Andre, and the other commissioners. And thank you all for participating here today. As you've heard, we have a very busy day with where we are going to be digging into two very important issues. Your diverse perspectives are very welcome. And as a logistic matter, just to remind you, after each panel presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions, comments, and other feedback. If you just put your card vertically, then I will know to call on you. So to start off, we are going to have our first panelist, Michael Gibson, who's the director of the Division of Supervision and Regulation for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and Rafael Martinez, who's a senior financial risk analyst for the Division of Swap Dealer and Intermediary Oversight at the CFTC, and they're going to be providing a status update on the implementation of uncleared margin rules.
Thanks for the opportunity to join your group today. I'm Mike Gibson. I'm from the Federal Reserve Board here in Washington, from Bank Supervision, but more importantly for this group, I'm also one of the two co-chairs of the International Working Group on Margin Requirements that's developed the uncleared margin standards that we're talking about today. and has been monitoring their implementation over the past few years. It's a joint working group that's co-sponsored by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and the International Organization of Securities Commissioners, IOSCO. So we have a broad representation on the group, and happy to talk about some of the progress that's been made over the past few years. Just to set the landscape, I would just remind everyone that as part of the post-financial crisis reform efforts under the auspices of the G20, there was an effort to improve the safety and security of derivatives markets. And probably the most important part of that effort was a shift of standardized derivatives into clearing. So obviously the CFTC has played a big part in that here in the US. Another part of the G20 program on derivatives markets was to have margin requirements on uncleared derivatives. There were two basic reasons for that. The first was to make sure that the program to move standardized derivatives into clearinghouses, that the incentives were right. So if uncleared derivatives had much lower requirements, there might be an incentive to avoid clearing, and nobody wanted to see that happen given the benefits of clearing for financial stability. And then just generally recognizing that not all derivatives can be cleared. There was a recognition that uncleared derivatives needed the safety and security that margin requirements provide to reduce the overall systemic risk in the system and the interconnectedness from derivatives markets. So with those two objectives in mind, the international standards on uncleared margin were developed and have been implemented over the past few years. As has already been mentioned, we're coming up on phase 5 of the implementation. Phases 1, 2, 3, and 4 mostly involve larger firms, and phase 5 is when some of the smaller entities are going to come in scope for the margin requirement. Just to remind everyone what these requirements are, the requirements are that for uncleared derivatives, there's an expectation that variation margin should be exchanged, and for entities that are above a threshold measured by exposure, that there would be an expectation that initial margin would be held as well. So the initial margin exposure threshold in the international standards is $50 million of exposure. So when we eventually finish with the implementation of these standards, there will be an expectation that entities with greater than $50 million of exposure, that there would be initial margin associated with those relationships. Of course, it's important to note for the scope of coverage of these requirements that it only applies to financial entities, so commercial end users are not scoped into these requirements. The phase 5 that's already been mentioned is what had been the final phase of implementation, and the implementation had been staggered based on notional amounts of derivatives that counterparties held. So the first phase, second phase, third phase, fourth phase, there were cutoffs based on notional amounts of derivatives, and this fifth phase would be bringing in, as was already mentioned, hundreds of small financial end users. The international working group that I mentioned has been doing monitoring of progress on implementation, and last year we had already started to hear from the industry counterparts about the challenges of bringing on board so many smaller entities in a relatively short period of time. 2 years is, I guess some people would say 2 years is a lot of time, but for all the requirements and the number of entities involved, 2 years is not that much time to do this onboarding. So a couple things happened at the international level earlier this year to relieve the burden on the phase 5 implementation. The first is that the Basel Committee and IOSCO put out a statement earlier this year clarifying that for counterparties that are below the $50 million exposure threshold, that they would not have to have all the trading documentations and custody arrangements that would be needed to post and secure initial margin, until they're actually crossing the threshold. So the smaller entities, it was clarified that they would not need to have the trading documentation and custody arrangements in place until they actually cross the threshold and fall in scope. And in that case, then, of course, they would be expected to have the arrangements in place. So that was the first effort out of the International Working Group earlier this year. The second thing that the Basel Committee and IOSCO did earlier this year was to extend the phase-in period by 1 year, as was already mentioned in the introduction. So there's an additional phase, I guess it should be called phase 6, which will extend through September 2021 for the smaller financial end users. Basically, it's splitting up the entities that would have come into scope in 2020 and splitting them up into 2 groups. So some will come in 2020, some will come in 2021. The U.S. prudential regulators are part of those discussions, and we supported those international changes. And again, as has been already mentioned, the prudential regulators have developed a notice of proposed rulemaking that the FDIC acted on at their board meeting. So the notice of proposed rulemaking from the FDIC is out in the public domain, and you can read it on their website. The Federal Reserve Board has not acted yet, so I can't speak for what the Federal Reserve Board would be voting on, but we are part of the prudential regulator group. So I'll just give you a description, a brief description of what the prudential regulators' notice of proposed rulemaking has. And again, this is based on what the FDIC has already put out into the public domain. So the first 2 elements of the notice of proposed rulemaking from the prudential regulators are the 2 things that I already mentioned that came out of the International Working Group earlier this year, namely the clarification on documentation not being needed for the small entities below the exposure threshold, and the additional phase-in into 2021. There's 3 other elements that I would just briefly mention as part of the notice of proposed rulemaking. The first two of these have to do with legacy swaps, and I just have to explain a little bit. Legacy swaps are those that were in place before these margin requirements came into effect, and the margin requirements are only applied to new trades. So existing trades aren't in scope for the requirements. And of course, a lot of derivatives trades are long dated, so there's an expectation that some of these legacy trades could last for a while. The 2 clarifications that are part of the notice of proposed rulemaking, the first is that these legacy swaps can be amended to replace LIBOR and other similar interest rate benchmarks that, as everyone knows, are being phased out and may disappear in a couple of years. Those contracts need to be amended, and the notice of proposed rulemaking proposes that swaps can be amended to replace LIBOR without losing their legacy swap status. And the second element related to legacy swaps is to clarify that so-called life cycle events like trade compressions would also not cause a legacy swap to lose its legacy status. The final element of the prudential regulator NPR that the FDIC released last week would be to remove the requirement in our rule that initial margin be collected from affiliates, although it would retain variation margin requirements for affiliates. This is consistent with the international standard, and of course there's other restrictions on affiliate transactions within bank holding companies that I won't go into, but the inter-affiliate margin requirements that had been in the prudential regulators rule were in addition to the existing requirements on bank holding companies, which would stay in place. So I'll stop there. That's and I look forward to answering your questions.
Mr. Martinez?
Good morning. So I've been asked to provide the update on the implementation, and a lot of the updates are actually coincide with actions taken by the prudential regulators. We may have sometimes a difference in terms of the ways we go about it. So we also have interim final rules or orders, no action letters, and different ways. And but in general, the objective is to remain harmonized with them. And I think we've done a quite a decent job of that. We have very frequent calls every week, and we have also not as frequent, but with the other regulators around the world that are implementing these rules. And so let me mention, much of it is similar to or the same as what Mike has just described to you. I'll mention some specific of how the CFTC, where the CFTC stands on that. With respect to the legacy status, so one big concern was that the rules apply prospectively, so for new swaps. All swaps were exempt from the rule, but in the US, any amendment to the rules, to the swaps, would bring in scope those swaps as they were amended. And we've discovered that actually there are specific situations in which it actually works contrary to what the intent of the rule is, which is to reduce the risk in the system. So Mike mentioned that about the one situation very clear to everybody is the situation with Brexit, in which it's clear that for no particular business decision of a lot of companies in Europe, and they will have potentially to change the counterparty to some swap to be able to service the clients. And so we want those swaps to be amended. And we don't want the margin requirements to be an impediment to that. So we had an interim final rule of the CFTC in March 2019 to say that swaps that are transferred legally solely as a result of a no-deal Brexit, it's just for the case of the no-deal Brexit, that any amendments that have to be made would not bring those legacy swaps into scope. For LIBOR transition, that Mike mentioned is part of the prudential rule. CFTC staff, we need to harmonize with the prudential regulators, but we also have to coordinate with other divisions, because for us in the CFTC, LIBOR is not just a question of margin, but it also touches on legacy status for clearing, for customer protection, reporting, and several other rules. So we have to find this way of harmonizing both across divisions and with the other regulators. And so we're a bit of second movers on that, but we are actively preparing policy for this right now, and we expect to have something for review by the Commission in the very near future. I should mention that the CFTC, we're having very frequent meetings with the ARC and the Alternative Reference Rate Committee to make sure that we have dialogue so that the relief that we offer is one that actually will be effective. Next, we also had in May of 2019, the Division of Sub-Dealer and Intermediary Oversight issued a no-action letter that provides relief to certain amendments to legacy swaps so that they don't lose their legacy status. They're all amendments that reduce the risk in the portfolios. And so the material amendments, partial termination and novations, swaps that result from multilateral compression. So all of these are actions that reduce the risk in the parts portfolio. And we had a request for that for some time. And Tara knows exactly how long it's in the month. But I think what really made this something we really needed to do was that it works with the LIBOR and the Brexit case. Because before amendments need to be made for Brexit and LIBOR, it's ideal that parties can compress and reduce the number of swaps that will have to be amended. So we're hoping that, and so that's what really triggered issuing this in March. And so it should be seen as part of the effort to facilitate LIBOR and Brexit. On issues related to 2020, to the phase-in and the congestion that had been identified. So the CFTC issued, as mentioned by Commissioner Stump, in July, an advisory codifying the guidance from the BCBS and IOSCO, so that I guess since initial margin is only exchanged when the exposure is above $50 million threshold, I think what we try to say is if you collect it, you protect it. But you don't need to protect something you have not been collected. And the protection required a lot of paperwork and was cited as one of the biggest burdens on industry for entities that may never exchange margin. Now, that $50 million threshold, to Commissioner Quinten's concern about the use of notional, and there's no doubt that notional is a very blunt measure of activity. We take this as this serves as a second step. If the first step was a calculation of notional, which, by the way, we have a lot of people that tell us they're having difficulty calculating notionals to decide if they're in scope or not. But then this second step helps figure out which ones are the relationships that really need to be margined by having that risk-based measured. It's not ideal, but it helps that after the notional decision of a minimum swaps activity to be in scope, we have this risk-based measure. Also, the phase-in extension. So, as the chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, we have drafted, the DSIO has drafted a proposed rule to put in place this extension that some prudential regulators proposed last week, and at the recommendation of BCBS and OSCO. So we prepare that, and that should be soon circulating for your consideration. Models for phase 5. It's one of the things that of the concern that has repeatedly come up is that developing models is a challenge for many of the phase 5 dealers. In addition to pre-approval, the requirements to ensure that the model is performing adequately, it's a continuing monitoring of the model and requires governance, extensive governance efforts by the firms, such as periodic backtesting, benchmarking, and external audits. And some have indicated they may use the simpler method of the grid, but that, as we know, tends to impose some higher margin requirements than the model. So there's other people that have expressed interest in using a third-party vendor for that. However, that brings the issue of the monitoring and all the governance, whether it's a calculation that's done in-house or by a third party. The firm has to retain responsibility to make sure that that model produces numbers that protect the firm. At this point, I want to mention that the National Futures Association, the NFA, with whom we have a lot of coordination, and we have also weekly calls, I think bi-weekly now, but sometimes weekly as needed. They've been very active reaching out to phase 5 dealers. In the US, the modeling requirements only go to the dealers, not to all the parties that have to exchange margin. So that's a difference we have with rules in other places. This has allowed us to concentrate specifically on the dealers. And the NFA has been very active, has spoken with every dealer, has asked them about their plans, have tried to respond to all their questions. And, they've had webinars, several of them, and they've generally tried to facilitate the process. So I want to thank the NFA for the wonderful job they've been doing on that. In terms of interaction with other rules, so this is not something the CFTC or the prudentials have done, but I would need to mention it, is that the SEC finalized the rule on margin requirements in June. And while there are significant differences with the WGMR-based standard, the commissions and staff at both agencies, and thank you, Commissioner Quintens, for your efforts on that, they've endeavored to close gaps to facilitate for those entities that are subject to not just the SEC rules, but other rules, including the CFTC. And, of particular note is that for a standalone security-based swap dealer that is also a swap dealer, that has below a certain level of activity, the SEC has allowed for compliance with their rules by complying with the CFTC rules, so a kind of substituted compliance with us. And I think that that was that's one of many changes that to the proposed rule by the SEC that has facilitated compliance for dual registrant. Then also I want to mention in terms of substituted compliance internationally that the CFTC has responded to requests for substituted compliance from major swap jurisdictions. So you will see that, and we think that's a major tool to ease compliance for many entities. And we currently have are working on comparability determination for the UK in the event of Brexit, so specific to the UK. And we have, I think, responded to almost every request that has come from any major jurisdiction. And there's some that we haven't received the request yet, so it's hard for us to act. But we have reacted to that. And I want to thank Frank Pisanich, our chief counsel in the SIO, for that. Now, industry and the public have brought forth many other issues, some of which will be mentioned later today. Since we don't have anything imminent or that we have done on that, I won't discuss them. But I look forward to those being brought in the presentation later today, because this is this committee is an excellent touch point for staff to listen and develop further understanding. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson and Mr. Martinez. In order to allow staff to listen and develop further understanding, I'd like to just open up the floor with a broad question. We heard a lot about the notice of proposed rulemaking from Mr. Gibson and similar initiatives that the CFTC has been engaged in since we last met. I'm wondering if people can give their perspectives on whether that notice of proposed rulemaking goes far enough in addressing the challenges faced with respect to the margin requirements that we're talking about today. Any additional suggestions for the regulators on what they could do with respect to margin rules? Apparently, you've done an excellent job. Mr. Cisewski.
So I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. The FDIC in the OCC's proposal, one element of that proposal would eliminate initial margin for inter-affiliate transactions. Is that right? I wonder if you could, just for the public, for the record, so to speak, if you could explain the purpose of inter-affiliate derivatives transactions, and then I'll have a follow-up.
Sure. So, within a consolidated group, there's going to be many legal entities, and different legal entities are facing different customers. So, within the group, there's often transactions among affiliates that are redistributing the risk around the group. Sometimes so it can be centrally managed in one place. Sometimes because a customer wants to face a legal entity in a particular jurisdiction, and the firm might prefer to have the risk managed out of Boston or New York. So there's a variety of, usually a variety of reasons why that.
And so it's quite literally transferring risk between legal entities with a group, right? And the risk management entity could be an entity in the United States, and it could be a bank, for example, with depositors. It could be some other type of regulated entity in the United States with customer funds. That's a yes. And we will continue to impose under the proposal variation margin requirements. Is that right? And those would account for market risk transactions.
Market. Yeah.
And the required IM that would be required today, that would account for other types of risks. Could you explain what those risks are in the event of a default of the affiliate?
Sure. So the initial margin is a protection, as you said, against default counterparty, and it's intended to protect. So the variation margin would protect against market changes today, and the initial margin is extra protection. Whatever happens between the time when the entity stops meeting its variation margin and the actual default occurs and the defaulted exposure is then crystallized, I guess you would say. So because the defaults don't happen instantaneously, the initial margin is a protected price might happen for that pre-default.
And that's modeled using certain assumptions and specifications specific to the portfolio of the affiliate, right?
Right. So for the initial margin requirements under the international standards, you're allowed the option of using a model that's been approved by your regulator, or you can use a standardized grid that has simpler calculations that are just based on the type of.
And so margin period of risk, talk about that. Could you explain the concept and how that relates to initial margin potential exposure?
Sure. So margin period of risk is the time period that I was talking about, where the time period right before the counterparty default, where maybe they've stopped making their variation margin payments, they're on their way to default, and over some time period, the non-defaulting counterparty is exposed. So that's why.
And the assumption currently for an inter-affiliate transaction within a bank holding company that move risk, let's say, for an affiliate to a U.S. bank, what's the margin period of risk that we would apply?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. Question. I'm sure there's some.
You know, by chance.
What's the margin period of risk that they would do without requirement?
For inter-affiliate margin, for initial margin imposed on inter.
Where there's no requirement, you mean? No requirement from these rules? Because in these rules, I believe at least on the CFTC rule for inter-affiliate margins with certain entities, there's some, not all, and the CFTC has requirement with broad exception for inter-affiliate transactions. Those that don't fall into one of these exemptions, they have a 5-day margin period.
5 days. So the assumption is essentially that in the event of the affiliate defaulting, within 5 days, you should be able to hedge out your risk and or liquidate positions in a way that mitigates the risk management, right?
Well, that's what the requirement is. The assumption that you would take exactly that amount would depend on the stock.
So that's a 5-day period right now for some transactions. But that's a sort of uniform rule for some complex portfolios between affiliates. It could actually take longer, in which case there'd be some residual risks. For some other portfolios, it might take 1 or 2 days. You could very easily manage your risks there. So how did you arrive at the 5-day period, or what was the thinking in a nutshell?
Well, the 10-day period of risk was the sort of starting point. So because that's used and has been used for many, many years as for the calculation, for capital calculation. And so those are things that are already used by entities in their calculations for capital, and we didn't want to have multiple numbers floating around or further the development system. For inter-affiliate, we thought it was appropriate to have a shorter period of risk because affiliates have a better sense. When a counterparty defaults, many times it's a bit of could be a surprise for the counterparty, right? So we imagine that from your affiliate you have a better sense of what the state would be of an affiliate, and we also thought that the company itself would have operationally it would be easier to protect themselves from a default than when it's a non-affiliated counterpart.
Right, so you were trying to come up with a rule that was tractable, but there could be portfolios that are especially complex where there's some residual risk. At the risk management entity, there could be portfolios.
That's correct. There's always that trade-off when you write a rule, right? In which you're trying to find something that is that can be complied with by that all the entities that are going to be subject to that rule. It's also something that is going to be easier for your examiners to evaluate, and so it's easy to understand, easy to apply, and roughly right, or at least not grossly wrong. Though, of course, the same happens with speed limit or anything like that, right?
So the purpose is for an inter-affiliate transactions to move risk around the corporation. The risk could be moved to the United States, could be moved to the bank. And there are certain assumptions about what that initial margin requirement will be. Those assumptions for many portfolios may sort of adequately account for the potential exposure, and in other cases we just acknowledge that may not actually. And now we're proposing to eliminate required initial margin altogether. So how are we? How do we look at managing potential exposure in the absence of a required initial margin? For example, for a U.S. bank.
So, with respect to U.S. bank holding companies, there's a lot of transactions among affiliates, global groups, and they have lots of. So there's existing protections and regulations on affiliate transactions and that provide some safeguards. So those are still in.
So, for example, Reg W, is that what you're referring to?
Yep.
Okay. And Reg W would apply to transactions between certain affiliates, but not all, right? So, transaction between bank chain entities, Reg W would not apply initial margin requirements, for example, that transaction between bank chain entities.
I'm not sure what bank chain entity is, but generally, Reg W applies to protect deposit.
So, in the case of a bank chain entity, my understanding is, and Mr. Yamato applying to weigh in on this, but that Reg W requirements would not apply, and in any event would require an arm's length transaction that would not necessarily impose required initial margin, at least at the level that would be required under the regulations currently. So, my only point in all of this is to say that by eliminating initial margin requirements under the prudential proposal, some of the prudentials, I should say, we actually are allowing risk to come back to the United States quite directly to regulated entities that have customer funds at risk or depositor money at risk. And that poses a number of concerns, not only for financial stability, but also in terms of whether the FDIC and the OCC, which have the primary mandate of protecting, for example, a national bank or other type of bank in the United States, specifically to that legal entity, that they're actually allowing risk to come into that entity, which is quite puzzling.
Mr. Klein, do you have some feedback?
I just wanted to go back to some comments that Michael made when he introduced the rule proposal and described the rationale behind eliminating the inter-affiliate initial margin requirement. And I think we talk not about transferring risk, but about managing risk. And I think that is one of the primary concerns, that imposing initial margin requirement can distort internally the ability to manage risk centrally by not moving risk around, but by distributing risk in a way that makes it easier for the entity to manage that risk and to reduce risk, not to put the risk someplace else. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. I also would harken back to Michael's comments about the existing Rule 23A and 23B requirements in Reg W that do impose very substantial restrictions on the ability within a bank holding company to engage in certain transactions with the deposit-taking institution and its immediate affiliates, and in fact require collateralization of many of these transactions. So again, there is an existing protective mechanism, particularly designed to protect the deposit-taking institutions, and a desire among bank holding companies to be able to put risk in a place where they can visualize it, manage it, and reduce it.
Thank you. Mr. Colby?
Hi, Jim Colby. I'm the treasurer of Honeywell. I also represent Coalition for Derivatives End Users. You were asking about why companies use inter-affiliate trade. And the primary reason companies use inter-affiliate transactions, and just using our company as an example, 1,000 legal entities around the world that have risks that try to manage. Each of those entities independently hedge those exposures, many of which are offsetting. It's very inefficient. We have unnecessary documentation requirements, using more bank credit lines than we really need. And we would have people engaging in derivative transactions that really don't understand how to risk manage the transaction much at the head office. So what we do is we calculate the businesses, all the different businesses around the world, report their exposures into us, centralize them, we net them down by risk category, and hedge the net risk externally for the bank. And so what this allows us to do is to dramatically reduce the amount of external facing derivative transactions that we have with the street. And it allows us to make sure that we have proper people entering into derivative transactions, controlling those transactions, make sure that they're properly. Dramatically lowers the amount of credit exposure that Honeywell has with our parties. Those credit lines cost money. And if we had to post, and if our bank counterparties were required to post initial margin both on intra-affiliate transactions and on external transactions counterparties they hedge, that's duplicative initial margin requirement on the same transaction. That cost, those costs are going to be passed on to us as end users, making it more costly for us to hedge risk. It should be pointed out that most inter-affiliate transactions, if the affiliate transact centralized treasury unit, transact street, or a bank counterparty, that end user that has an original exposure also has an underlying exposure on the other. So they're not taking naked risk. They have a risk with their customers or with their suppliers. They hedge it with the centralized treasury unit to their head. Centralized treasury has a transaction with their international affiliate, and then they hedge it with a bank to their head. So it's a very efficient way of managing risk. And I think that, you're talking about imposing duplicative initial margin requirements across a legal entity structure, that's extremely inefficient. And I think it will reduce hedging activity. It imposes costs that overweigh any risk management.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury?
I just want to switch gears a little bit, and you asked this question of if we're sort of perfectly satisfied with how all the initial margin rules are going to roll out, and that is kind of the central thesis of today's discussion. I don't want to go through all of the things that Wendy and Richard are going to highlight in the next section, as well as the custodians, but I think from our perspective as an investment management firm, it's not just the sheer numbers that are going 40 to hundreds, but we're really different. We're not banks, and our businesses are organized differently. In my firm, we manage funds that have commingled for different investors. We manage separately managed accounts. Just literally our business models are different. And so what I am very encouraged is that the commission and other regulators are willing to listen to us about these practical implementation issues. We're not trying to get out of the initial margin regime. Actually, firms like ours manage a number of hedge funds. We've been posting initial margin for a very long time. So, come on in, the water is fine. But I think there are very different specific issues. And what would be great is if they could get addressed before the rules hit. It's very striking to think of the FDIC putting out the inter-affiliate margin thing after banks have posted $40 billion of inter-affiliate margin, right? So I don't know what the right or wrong answer is. I'll stay out of that. I'm not a bank, but it's great that you're actually looking at these things before the rules will hit most investment firms and other non-dealer entities, and we really appreciate that attention. And I would encourage you. I've read both, Richard and Wendy's remarks, and they have a lot of just really practical issues that we need advice on, and we may need rule changes on, as well as a little more global harmonization. How you invest the collateral. They're just sort of things where the rules interact with our fiduciary duties and our investment objectives for our underlying investors.
I'm sensitive to time, so Ms. Belich, I'm going to give you the last question in the room. comment in the room, and then we'll shift to the buy side panel after we check some phone.
I'll be very same, not to take later, but as additional of items that we seek to consider are a dealer's responsibility to monitor our production. Part well, what does that look like? Yeah. Some other sees from what is that area. Then just brush on what earlier. Of course, just to kind of reiterate that there have
Thanks. Before we switch to the next panel, do we have any comments or questions from the phone? Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson and Mr. Martinez. And I welcome the second panel. Great. So now we're going to shift to our second panel. As was highlighted at the end of our last panel, we are going to focus on practical implementation issues, specifically the buy side's perspective on uncleared margin rules. Our presenters to start us off are Richard Grant, who's the Global Head of Regulatory and Government Affairs, the Associate General Counsel of AQR Capital Management, and Wendy Yoon, Managing Director and Associate General Counsel, Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Angie, and thank you, Commissioner Stump, for sponsoring this committee and the rest of the Commission for your engagement on the issues. I've been asked today to represent the Managed Funds Association, share a buy-side perspective on implementing regulatory initial margin. Grateful for the opportunity, and wanted to start by conveying our appreciation to the CFTC for your leadership responding to industry concerns on this topic, which include former Chairman John Carlo's letter to Vice Chair Quarles and the interpretive guidance the SIO director. I thought that the committee might benefit from an inside look at what we're doing at AQR to come into compliance with regulatory IM requirements. I hope this will give you a better sense of the heavy lift the regulation requires for individual buy-side entities, as well as some concrete examples of complexities. At AQR, we manage a number of different types of accounts that will be subject to regulatory margin, including both individual and multi-manager. Given the far-reaching scope of Reg IM, we formed an internal working group over 2 years in advance of the relevant deadline. The project touches on a number of different aspects of the firm, and our group includes representatives from 8 different entities or offices within the firm. Legal, to analyze rules and negotiate documents. Our operations team, develop internal systems and processes for the transfer and tracking of daily margin calls. Our engineering team, to create a program for calculating and tracking ANA in multiple jurisdictions. Our counterparty risk team for SIM vendor selection and determining the scope of acceptable collateral for dealers. Portfolio finance to work through the SIM calculation methodology and analyze the Reg IM impact on free cash and the investment of initial margin. Our compliance team develop and test policies, procedures, and reporting required in certain jurisdictions. Our portfolio implementation team to analyze the cost and impact of OTC instruments subject to the rules. And finally, our trading team determine the optimal instruments to use under the new regime based on market response and pricing. Now, this group is currently working through a series of key milestones for implementing the rule, which cover many of the topics I just mentioned, including other items like securing custodial relationships, client communication and education, counterparty testing, and the overall cash management process. As with any project of this scope, a number of challenges have arisen each step along the way. The challenges are not insurmountable for buy-side firms, but I hope that hearing them will provide you with some detail and color on the process we're going through, and also context for why buy-side firms need to seek assistance from regulators. Some of the burden. So a few of the specific challenges I'll highlight today are the ANA calculation. Now, although the calculation itself seems fairly straightforward, the global nature of the initial margin regime adds complexity to the building of a system to compute and track the calculation, because it must account for jurisdictional differences related to product scope, calculation methodology, and the calculation time. Also, SIM vendors. Now, calculating daily margin will be facilitated for many of us by third-party SIM vendors, but outsourcing that process creates its own challenge. We at AQR have met with a number of the vendors, and many of them do not yet have capabilities to handle all of the product required for in-scope accounts. That limits our ability to effectively test the system. Operational challenges. So a significant amount of effort is required to build the pipes necessary to implement the rule. For example, selecting a SIM vendor is really only the first step in the developing capabilities to calculate and transfer initial margin. Next, we have to build a system to convey the relevant portfolio positions to the SIM vendor and then receive back the result of the SIM calculation. That number must then feed into another new system that compares it to the dealer-provided initial margin number to confirm the final amount sowed. Next, a file containing the final margin number must feed into the firm's existing system for calculating and transferring margin so that a wire transfer for the ultimate regulatory IM can be executed. As you can imagine, the technology and systems integration challenges related to this process are extremely time and resource. Finally, legal agreements. Legal documentation challenges associated with the rule are frequently discussed as a headache. At AQR, we already have tri-party agreements in place, post-negotiated initial margin with custodian. Yet, for each in-scope account, we will need to negotiate new tri-party agreements with each dealer counterparty for posting our regulatory IM, along with separate tri-party agreements, the initial margin posted by the dealer. Now, in addition to these tri-party agreements, we'll also need to negotiate ISDAs and CSAs with each counterparty to govern regulatory IM. Each of these time-sensitive negotiations will stretch the bandwidth of even the most sophisticated buy-side firms, custodian, dealer. Now, given these numerous challenges, what's our take? It seems obvious, but I think we must acknowledge that we're likely to see a rush near the final deadline, even the extended deadline, as the full universe of in-scope accounts seek to apply. And this could put a significant strain on the industry. This rush will not solely be due to the relative preparedness of buy-side firms. Many of the challenges with regulatory initial margin relate to other parties in the system, be they SIM vendors, dealer counterparties, or custodians. And each of these entities will need to make their own judgment calls about where to deploy their resources for Reg IM onboarding. So there's a very real chance that some buy-side firms see their implementation delayed despite their best efforts to plan ahead. Now, the question before this committee is what regulators can do about the situation. While many of the challenges I just mentioned might arise with any project of this magnitude and cannot be solved by the regulatory community, we believe that any action regulators take, the overall burden on industry, will pay huge dividends by allowing resources to be focused on the most important aspect of the regime. To that end, the initial margin phase-in threshold recently introduced was a very positive development, and I would also point to comment letters by MFA and other industry groups that provide helpful discussion. However, the one regulatory action I want to discuss today is resolving the current mismatch treatment of physically settled FX swap forward in the ANA initial margin calculation. Forcing these products to be included in the ANA calculation, even though they don't require initial margin, places an undue burden on firms and the financial system as a whole without a clear regulatory regulatory benefit. An example might be helpful. Point. Take a managed futures fund with large FX futures position. That fund would generally prefer to use futures contracts rather than swaps to gain exposure in a given country. However, if the desired exposure relates to a futures contract that's not approved by the CFTC, such as SMI, the Swiss Market Index, then the fund would use a swap. In that scenario, a fund may exceed the $8 billion ANA threshold and become in scope under regulatory initial margin almost entirely because of its physically settled FX position. Yet, it's extremely unlikely that it would ever post initial margin, given its small OTC swap exposure and the $50 million IM threshold. Despite recent guidance on systems and documentation needs for funds that are unlikely to exceed the $50 million margin threshold, as an in-scope fund, it would still need to be included in systems that track the ANA calculation and monitor the initial margin against the threshold. This type of incremental burden for a single fund is magnified when extended throughout the global financial system. By adjusting the mismatch of physically settled FX swap forward, regulators could free up resources for industry to use on entities with much more meaningful OTC swap exposures that are the real focus. With that, I thank you for the opportunity to share our experiences, and I'll turn it over.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Commissioner Stump, for hosting today's meeting and for your focus on this important issue for us. I'd also thank the chairman and other fellow commissioners, as well as the members of the GMAC committee, for the opportunity today to discuss some of the outstanding issues that asset managers and our end user clients continue to face in implementing the later phases of the mandatory initial margin rules. First, please note that the views that I expressed today are my own and those representing the SIFMA Asset Management Group, or AMG, and not of my firm. We also fully commend and support the actions taken by BCBS IOSCO, the June 23rd statement, and the recent prudential regulators' proposal to extend the implementation periods and splitting phase 5 essentially into 2 separate phases and adopting a $50 billion threshold for 2020. We would also support the March 5th BCBS IOSCO statement as reflected in the CFTC Advisory 1916 and the prudential regulators' proposal to also not require documentation, operational, or custodial setups unless the initial margin does exceed the 50 million IM threshold. We would strongly encourage, though, that global regulators adopt both standards so that we can achieve much needed regulatory consistency and clarity across jurisdictional requirements. Absent such, it will cause a lot more disruption and uncertainty in how to implement the rules in the final stages for many of us. While those actions would provide some much needed time for us to get ready for the last 2 phases, I think it's important to highlight that by itself will not solve for some of the scoping and implementation challenges that we as asset managers and our end user clients are confronted with. By way of background, many of us manage money for a wide variety of different types of clients, whether it be corporates, sovereigns, large pension funds, central banks, and other types of entities, each of which we typically are hired by that client to employ a specific investment strategy. Many clients do hire multiple asset managers because they want to, one, diversify their investment portfolio, and 2, take advantage of the expertise that particular manager has in a particular mandate or strategy. And 3, to diversify any kind of concentration risk they would have to any one of them. In these types of arrangements, many of us set up our own trading agreements for our clients, and we have no transparency nor control into the trading activity of our clients outside of our mandates. As a result of this practice, it makes it quite challenging for us to implement some of the key features of the UMR rules. More specifically, in relation to the ANA calculation, the sharing of the 50 million IM threshold, and MTAs. These parts of the rules require us to have concerted efforts to collect data on an aggregate basis. And unfortunately, in many cases, the burden, lies with our clients. Our clients are the ones who then have to collate and aggregate the information, not only for their own asset managers across the different trading mandates that they employ, but also of any kind of consolidated affiliates that they also are consolidated with from a financial statements perspective. Some clients have already highlighted that they will not be able to get the information from some of their affiliates because they don't have any type of transparency or relationships with those affiliates to gain knowledge of the information. Other clients have expressed concerns, and we too have concerns about how they will calculate the ANA amount. Some of us already reached out to clients and asked them to confirm whether or not they exceed the ANA threshold. Unfortunately, some have gone out earlier and asked about the 8 billion. Others have asked about the 50 billion. Some have asked about both. And it's also been a mixed bag in terms of how much detail, how much information you're collecting from those clients. Some have gone out and asked clients to just highlight if they exceed a general number like 5 billion or 6 billion, and to come back to the asset manager to the extent they do, so that the asset manager can work with those clients more closely to refine their calculations and determine whether or not they truly do exceed the ANA threshold amounts. Others have gone out with more specificity and asked clients to calculate the ANA amounts across different jurisdictions, whether it be March, April, May, June, July, and August, across different types of asset classes or different types of products. As you know, in the different jurisdictions, there are different requirements. Some instruments are in scope in some jurisdictions, some are not. So the inclusion of equity options, potentially TBAs, the definition of FX forwards or spots, those all differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it becomes quite challenging to give a client guidance as to the specific calculation that they must do in order to give you the accurate information per jurisdiction for you to then get the aggregate number. As a result of all of this, we do see that there's likely to be delays in the implementation and the response feedback from our clients with their ANA information, which puts more pressure on asset managers in the buy side in terms of the implementation once you get confirmation if the client does exceed the ANA threshold amounts. By virtue of having to wait for that confirmation because the asset managers and the dealers with whom we trade do not have the transparency as to the client's overall trading activity, that means we have to wait and see whether or not the clients come back to us with confirmation that they are over the amount, and then immediately start working with the dealers to determine whether or not we also exceed the 50 million IM threshold. While we appreciate the time and the confirmation from many of the regulators that we don't have to employ documentation and the operational readiness in order to comply until we exceed the 50 million, again, that is a number that we're not in control of, and we don't have any transparency as to when the client may exceed that number with the dealer and its affiliates. All we can see is the trading activity that we carry out in our own portfolios for our clients. And so at any given time, the dealer may call us and tell us that now the client is in scope, either because they've crossed the internal threshold set by that dealer or the 50 million in the aggregate. This poses a lot of concerns for us because now, without any notice, we will have to scramble to try to get resources focused on getting ready with that particular dealer for that particular client. And unfortunately, as asset managers, we do not hold the assets of our clients. We cannot choose their custodians because we don't have the authority in the investment management agreement. For us to do so, we would need to potentially amend our IMAs to give us the authority to actually select their tri-party custodian. We would also then potentially have to think about other issues such as, the regulations that apply to some of our clients, like mutual funds and European regulated funds, whereby the custodian must be a qualified custodian or meet certain regulatory requirements. They may have to enter into subdelegation of strict liability requirements for funds subject to AIFMD in terms of the third-party custodian holding assets of the fund pledged to the swap counterparties. So for those reasons, we typically will work with a client's individual custodian rather than ourselves picking a single one and setting up all the necessary trading agreements and account control agreements for the tri-party segregation of the initial margin. This means that there are a lot more third-party custodians that may not have been involved in the first initial phases that are now going to be tapped on the shoulder and have to get prepared for the documentation requirements in the latter phases. In many cases, it takes anywhere from 6 months to a year to negotiate the tri-party IM segregation agreements, and we are concerned about the readiness of some of the smaller custodians who may not have experience in the earlier phases to be able to prepare for this requirement. The additional issue is that we all will be, trying to go through the same pipeline, getting the attention of the dealers and the custodians to prepare for the necessary documentation and operational setups. Again, we will go through the same pipeline. We will be asking for the same attention from the same resources. Dealers may choose, in some instances, based on the trading activity of the particular asset manager, to put some on the sidelines or to halt trading with some of us based upon our trading activity versus some of the other peers that might have larger trading books with them. So that could be a potential disruption, not only to the deployment of our trading mandate, but just in terms of the client's performance under our assets under management. So that is something that we are very concerned about. Once you get the ANA information, as we mentioned, the focus then turns to the IM threshold and the sharing of that amount. Right now, at any given time, the dealer must now perform two separate calculations on a daily basis. The initial margin requirement in relation to their existing book, as well as what is the simulated initial margin that would be required under whichever model that they're using for initial margin, and to determine whether or not that amount exceeds 50 million. So that is a daily requirement, maybe having to be done on a dynamic basis across all affiliates, trading with that client and its affiliates. So you could see how much of a burden that will be, as well as the potential surprise when clients come close to that 50 million. So one of the proposals that we've highlighted in this IFMA AMG letter is to potentially consider having the initial margin be calculated on an annualized basis during the same relevant ANA periods that currently exist under the rules, whether it be March, April, May, or June, July, and August. We feel that this would be an opportunity for the regulators to be and the dealers to be able to focus only on those types of accounts that really truly present any type of systemic risk. And it would also narrow the number of clients that we would be waiting to hear back from in relation to potentially exceeding the $8 billion figure. So it would mitigate and alleviate the dependency and the latency in relation to getting the client feedback in relation to their ANA calculation, as well as allowing people to really focus on those portfolios that really truly are close to the $50 million thresholds. So that was something that we would ask the regulators to consider, and happy to take any more questions about that proposal. In relation to other types of issues that we are confronted with, include seeded funds. Many of us have had seeded funds that have to go early because of the consolidation requirements under the CFTC rules and prudential regulators rules. And unfortunately, in those instances, trying to set up all the necessary documentation and trying to get the resources and the attention of our dealer counterparties have been quite challenging in the earlier phases. In some instances, we've only been limited to less than a handful of counterparties in meeting the regulatory deadlines, which causes other issues for fiduciary asset managers, such as achieving best execution, mitigating counterparty risk, and meeting counterparty exposure limits under different jurisdictional requirements, and just overall risk mitigation and concentration of that risk in the hands of a few dealer counterparties. We would urge the CFTC and prudential regulators to consider potentially not requiring the seeded funds to be consolidated. Again, it's a passive investment by a sponsor firm, many of which do not act in concert and have no transparency or control into the trading activity of the actual seeded fund. I'd also note that in Europe, the rules under EMIR do not require EU-regulated funds to have to consolidate, and in some instances, in relation to some of the CCAVs and UCIT funds that also have been seeded, some asset managers have intentionally made sure to only limit the trading of those funds with European dealers in order to take advantage of that ability to deconsolidate. So thus, you might see a bifurcation of liquidity in the market and also some regulatory arbitrage as people take advantage of those deconsolidation abilities under other rules. In both instances, we would encourage global regulators to not require seeded funds to consolidate in general, and in Europe to not just limit this only to the European regulated funds, but for all seeded funds. The other issue that we would like to highlight is in relation to the types of collateral that are permitted. In many cases, as a CFTC study has highlighted, in the past, most asset management managers and their end user clients have used cash as collateral. I think the CFTC study had shown over 77% use it for variation margin. This is because that it is the easiest form of collateral to transfer. There's no margin haircuts on it. You avoid settlement issues. You don't need traders or other employees buying and selling different types of non-cash collateral, such as treasuries, dealing with odd lot sizes or settlement issues. And this is extremely important as the time frames and compression for margin transfer timing has continued to condense. So for us, the ability to be able to use cash as an eligible form of collateral and take advantage of the services of many custodians and sweeping that cash into money market funds and pledging that as collateral is something that we would like to continue to be honored. Under the CFTC rules and prudential regulators rules, there's some limitations to the use of money market funds, such as the ability of those money market funds to engage in repos and securities lending type transactions. We feel that those types of limitations are burdensome and unwarranted. If you look at other CFTC rules, such as in relation to Regulation 1.25, for any type of money market funds that are government only, there is no limit on the use of those types of money market funds as reinvestment, for reinvestment purposes of customer margin. So we would ask that there is similar consistency in relation to the treatment of money market funds under these regulations. In Europe, even though there is also recognition of money market funds, there are also similar limitations in relation to their use. Again, we would ask the global regulators to examine these limitations and whether or not they should be removed so that we can continue the practice of using them. It helps us not only mitigate our exposures to the custodian banks, but also it helps us to be able to meet the necessary transfer timing and the ability to continue to use cash and avoid the settlement issues that we would face with transferring non-cash collateral. The last thing I would highlight is in relation to FX, as Richard highlighted, the inclusion of FX means that there's probably 30% more of clients in scope for phase 5 and 6 than are warranted. Many of them will not exceed the $50 million IM threshold. And also, as Commissioner Quintes had noted earlier, the use of notional as a blunt instrument in measuring risk here is somewhat punitive, because in the case of FX, many times people will offset their risk in their books by entering into offsetting transactions. This means you have two directional trades, both of which will count from a notional perspective towards your ANA calculation, even though despite your risk portfolio is essentially flat. So we would ask that you reconsider and take a look at whether or not FX should be excluded from the ANA calculations on a go-forward basis. The last thing I would mention too is in relation to the models. In relation to what Rafael Martinez had highlighted earlier, some jurisdictions require us to use models and do the back testing. Already, it is a challenge for us from an operational perspective. Right now, we're having conversations with our dealer counterparties, not only to determine what models, what regulations they are applying, whether or not they're using, in some cases, EMIR versus Dodd-Frank rules, because many dealers are subject to multiple jurisdictional requirements based on their trading activity, but also different models that they may be employing for different asset classes. For us to be effectively able to manage and to check the margin requirements, we need to know whether or not dealers are using the SIM calculator, the grid, or their own proprietary models. And then we have to decide whether or not it's worth it for us to build out our margin models or to use vendors to be able to replicate so that we don't have any breaks when exchanging margin with those particular dealers. In some instances, I'm afraid that, for some end user clients, the cost may be too heavy and too much to be able to support and justify the use of derivatives. They may be an elimination of certain counterparties based upon the fact that they have different jurisdictional requirements. It's too complex or complicated, or may take too many resources to dive into their rules and their requirements. And absent subsidy compliance or deference by the global regulators, we may have no choice but to potentially turn off some of those trading lines unless we want to do the extra work to be able to comply with their other jurisdictional requirements. I'll stop there for any questions that the panel may have.
Thank you, Ms. Yoon and Mr. Grant, for your very detailed presentation of both some of the challenges that you're facing on the buy side, as well as some proposed actions, which I'm sure the regulators in the room are very appreciative of. I'd like to take a few minutes just to get feedback from other GMAC panel members, both on the comments around challenges and actions that our panelists raised, but also if there are any other challenges or actions that you would recommend from a buy-side perspective. Ms. Guest?
Well, I'm not speaking from a buy-side perspective. I really thank you for your remarks. It's really helpful to have had you shed some light on the challenges. And I think from the perspective of end users and smaller swap dealers, I think a lot of those challenges are shared. One that Mr. Grant glossed over a little bit, but I sort of implied in what you said is the challenges. In some cases, depending upon how your book work, may have different asset classes that different booking systems for. And so the data challenge of flattening that data, if you will, to be able to feed everything into the model can actually be an extraordinarily massive project. So I'm sure that's probably part of what you guys were looking at, but I did just want to call attention to it because data challenges are actually pretty significant. I also support a lot of what you said, Ms. Yoon. I think the challenges that you see are that we're seeing as well, and in some ways living through. And one of the things I wanted to call attention to the letter that I think late night, but is in the packet, but it's a letter from Smith that highlights another logistical challenge, if you will, that comes up, conflicting models at play. And I think it's important for the Commission to take a look at that. There are some significant challenges if you have, say, a SIM model. Simply see turning off trade same, and both letter is at high level allow effective substitute compliance, but say you can rely on big dealer to run their model, run your own risk checking, but rely on that dealer to address some of them. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury?
Yeah, I just want to go a little deeper on a couple of points. You covered so much stuff. So just to clarify, how often are you supposed to do the ANA calculation?
The ANA calculations are done through the measurement periods prescribed by the jurisdictional requirements. So again, it depends. In some cases, it's done through the June, July, and August measurement period. In others, it's March, April, May. In some instances, it's on a daily average calculation. In other instances, it may be the last day of the month. Again, it varies. And so the information that you're collecting from your clients, if you want it to that level of accuracy and specificity, you would need to identify the dealer counterparties with whom you're trading and the ANA requirements in relation to that specific jurisdiction, and ask the client to collect that data on that basis.
So you're going to a pension fund client for whom you manage a piece of their money, and you're asking them first to do this threshold calculation regularly, right? Particularly if they're kind of close to the margin. And then you go to every dealer, let's assume they are over the threshold, near the threshold on the ANA, you then have to go to every trading counterparty and ask them to do a calculation on all the business they do with that pension fund, but with all their managers.
Yeah, unfortunately for the swap dealers, they're not going to also have transparency to the client's overall trading activity outside of the trades that are done with them. So they are reliant as covered swap entities to, for the client to confirm whether or not they exceed the ANA thresholds for that particular year. So again, there's a lot of reliance. In some cases, some dealers have asked for, representations, which is quite alarming because, again, the numbers and the feedback you might be getting from clients may not be exact. It may be just based on using more of a blunt calculation across their portfolios and not getting into the nuance. But, again, once you get that information, you have to go notify the dealers that that particular account is now potentially in scope has crossed the ANA threshold, and that's when you begin the dialogue and the focus on whether or not they also will exceed the 50 million.
That's talk a lot about client communication and education, because so many of the funds, a lot of the clients we work with, they're not digging into the details of, they don't understand the heavy lift that they have in front of them. And then what we've even seen since the addition of the new threshold category or the 1-year delay, we've had certain clients who just say, we heard there's a delay, talk to us later. Like not even wanting to have the conversation now, though there's a bit of a lift on their part.
And let's say you're managing a piece of a client's portfolio and your exposure isn't that big for what you do, and you're notified by the client or by the dealer that you might have to put in place all the contractual things. It's obviously a little hard for you to predict, but are you going to just stop trading swaps for that client? If it's, is there going to be some sort of a degradation of your investment strategy because you decide it's basically just not worth it, can't handle, or they can't handle the compliance burden to use these instruments?
I think there are going to be a lot of individual client discussions, internal discussions about what makes sense, magnitude across your entire client. And it may not be our decision, but something Wendy and I've talked about before is that dealers may be making, as they are trying to think about the effort to place all of these agreements. And at some point they may say, for a given client, I have a series of assets working with them, and some may have a sliver of that overall account, and I'm going to put them to the back of the line and may not get their documentation until I've read it. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I would agree with Richard. It's not only our independent decision, but again, of the dealer counterparties. And again, it's dependent on a number of factors, including the type of portfolio that you're running for that particular client, whether or not you can gain the similar types of economic exposures through other instruments or not. Again, the dealers really hold the cards too, because you may run a very small hedging book or FX book with that particular dealer. They could decide to put you at the back of the line or to tell you to please move your positions because they'd rather deal with the accounts that are much more heavy use of the 50 million. Now that also puts the smaller smaller asset managers and those with smaller trading books, at a more disadvantaged position because again, with dealers having to weigh the resources and the cost benefits, you could see how in some cases they're going to be left, on the sidelines.
All right, and then I'll just make one other comment that's more from our perspective. That is that as a firm, we, all other things being equal, we prefer cleared products. It's more efficient. We have to post margin on non-cleared swaps already. As I mentioned, we've had to do that for a very long time. And so, if we can use a futures contract, it's very efficient, economical, it's a great thing. But there are products that we need to use to implement an investment strategy that just aren't available in a cleared. Maybe they're particular, specialized. They have terms that don't match. There are obviously clear business reasons why that. And so I think we would really view it as extremely unfortunate if all of the regulatory burden, which doesn't have a clear impact on risk reduction, ends up making these markets for uncleared swaps less efficient, harder to access, all of those things, because we only use them where we don't have other good choices. And I think that's just an important thing. You need to preserve the market for these kinds of instruments and not unduly burden it. I think a lot of the suggestions that are in these comment letters and other things would really help reduce the burdens, in particular in ways that don't affect systemic risk.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments on the phone? All right, with that, we thank you very much, Ms. Yoon and Mr. Grant, and we will take a 10-minute break. Great, so we're going to continue our deep dive into margin with our third panel, where we are going to hear about the custody bank's perspectives on implementation of the uncleared margin rules. We are going to start off with Dominic Falco, who's the Managing Director and Head of Segregation at BNY Mellon, And we will also hear from Judson Baker, who's the head of product development for derivatives and collateral services at Northern Trust.
Good morning. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for allowing us to have the opportunity to express the view of the marketplace from the custodian. To maybe put this all into perspective, I'd just like to kind of wind the clock back to 2016. I've been at the bank for about 12 years, and so I've been overseeing this process since the inception, and in fact, some of the build-up prior to in 2016, from the BNY Mellon perspective, just to give some numbers to add some context to the discussion, we set up approximately 600 accounts or so. In 2017, we set up a further 400 accounts, and in 2018, we set up about 500. This past year, we set up 1,000 accounts, so basically 2/3 as many as program in live. I would mention that there's been a lot of publicity, I would say, about the first phase, and so some of the delays as it related to the custodians in terms of being able to set up those accounts on time. And that really was, from that point in time, an issue of doc negotiation and really the flow of documents. What I would say is the industry has gotten much, much better in terms of their ability to negotiate those documents, negotiating the account control agreements, which govern the segregated accounts, at the same time that the CSAs are being negotiated as well. So within the 1,000 accounts that we set up in 2019, frankly, with very, very few issues, all of those were set up on. Interestingly enough, as it relates to the discussions around the $50 million threshold, some accounts, a further 100 of those have actually been delayed to post September 1, simply because the size of the balances and the expectation for being able, requiring to exchange collateral really wasn't there. So in effect, really, this phase has been large. Looking forward to 2020, our guesstimations from our perspective probably setting up about 2,400. So from that perspective, more than double our first year. So really, the road forward is really an up. Really, from our perspective, again, it's predominantly two documents that we're the most focused on. It's the account control agreement, as well as some will say the eligible collateral schedule is a separate document, but in fact they form a package. The account control agreement is really an important doc for any of the participants to determine at the very, very outset which custodian and which regime they actually are planning to use to segregate the collateral. The custodian and the ultimate regime that they and their counterparty fall under will dictate the documentation that's required. There are 4 tri-party custodians, Euroclear and Clearstream, who are the ICSDs, JP Morgan, and ourselves. As you deal with an ICSD versus a traditional custodian in the tri-party space, the documentation is slightly different. And similarly, if you're dealing with an EU27 regulated entity, and all 4 use those for the purposes of dealing with EU27 clients post-Brexit, there are additional documentation requirements that need to. Some of the issues around the documentation really are the interplay of the CSA as well as the account control. One of the issues that the industry has raised to us on a number of occasions is that it is really actually the ISDA agreement that delays the finalization of the account control agreements. And so oftentimes we find these bottlenecks that are happening at the very, very end of the negotiation. As I mentioned, fewer of those this year, but I can see going into 2020 that we would expect that again. From BNY Mellon's perspective, we really are doing a thorough review of our documentation. We're looking at much of the optionality that we currently have in our documentation, and then opening that optionality up further to clients so that we can reduce the amount of bespoke negotiation that we need to do on a going forward basis. Ideally, our desire would be to get to a non-negotiated document on its surface, but have a number of options that clients can actually opt into or opt out of. In addition, we are looking at utilization of the ISDA Create program or the platform in order to make doc negotiation and then ultimately the consumption of those options and the documents much faster on our side. So really, our perspective is going into 2020 and 2021, we really need to look at as much automation and easing the burden as much as possible. From the eligible collateral schedule point of view, I think a lot was raised about cross-jurisdictional issues, and it really is the cross-jurisdictional issues that make the eligible collateral schedule a little bit of a delay in terms of completion. What we see is that the eligible collateral schedule is generally the last document to be completed, even after the account control agreement and the CSA. And really, it's an issue of the regulations will require certain amounts of collateral, certain types of collateral, with prescriptive haircuts and concentration limits. And I always say, if you think about that, the regulations put the acceptable collateral into a box, and then depending upon the types of regulations the counterparties are impacted by in a cross-jurisdictional space, that would actually make the box smaller. And then as the individual parties, particularly the collateral receiver, takes a look at the type of collateral and then negotiates that down, it becomes smaller still. And this process often takes a while. What we had seen with dealers in the first couple phases was really to have equivalence in terms of those collateral schedules, and generally to have them as broad as possible. I think as we move into the buy side, and this we've seen with some buy side clients, their view is certainly with some of the alts that have been impacted in the past couple of phases, their view is to potentially have a wide type of collateral schedule to ultimately make the cost of collateral that priced into the trade, as I think raised earlier, less burden. So the past phase, we've seen more asymmetric collateral schedules as opposed to symmetric that we've seen in. A couple of other things just really to note from our perspective. We've engaged in client outreach for about 18 months in terms of notifying clients about the regulations, bringing in some of the industry participants to explain the different pieces around the regulations. And we do these in a variety of roundtables with clients. Typically what we've done, certainly in the US, really have those roundtables by a client type. So we've had insurance roundtables, asset manager roundtables, alts roundtables. As we go internationally, what we've done really has been more regional. So we've had them in some of the key capital cities in Europe and Asia as well. And really the importance is really to raise the awareness of the reg, introduce some of the issues such as the calculation for IM and the SIM model, bringing in some of the industry constituents to really explain. The feedback has actually been good, and I think what we've seen is a lot of engagement from clients on. In terms of what we're seeing for 2020, right now we are already in the phase of client onboarding. So the good thing I think that we've seen over the past 4 years is the mantra that we and many other industry participants talk about of it's never too early to start. It's actually started. We've seen from some clients, certainly in the alts community, those that are initially are already posting initial amounts, so house IA, or a number of different phrases around that. Some of those clients have actually said that they want to move into a tri-party structure, and their intent is to actually have that up and running by, call it the end of this year or early next year, with the view of being able to post their house IA, ultimately regulatory IM, through that same account. One other thing that we've noted from the clients that have started with us on the buy side, again, predominantly alts, most of them are actually using the greater of methodology of collateralizing. So this is one where there's a house IA number and then there's a regulatory IM number. the calculations are both made. The greater of the two is the number that's actually posted. Ultimately, that account needs to be reg compliant, so it's documented under reg compliant documents. Collateral types are reg compliant collateral types, and so it eases a little bit of the burden of having multiple accounts out. Specifically to the number of accounts, I know there's been a lot of discussion around the implementation, or the recommendation, I should say, of 50 million threshold. From BNY Mellon's perspective, we're very supportive of this. I think one of the challenges that we saw very early on in the discussion was the potential for a number of accounts that would need to be set up, tying up legal, onboarding, and other resources within the firm, which frankly would never be funded. And so from our perspective, not have to do that is actually a good thing, rather to jump through hurdles. One other thing that I really did want to raise, and I know a lot of discussion has gone on around the SMAs, and really the notification into the asset managers as it relates to the ultimate asset owner, declaring themselves as being in scope. One of the concerns, I think, from the custodian's perspective is any delays that come in through this process actually impacts us to a very large degree from the perspective of KYC and AML. From our perspective, whether you are a collateral provider or a collateral receiver on our program, we do need to do KYC review of accounts, and any delays in terms of identification of those accounts has a material impact to our ability to set up clients on time. From that perspective, anything where we can do to speed up the disclosure of clients that are in scope would actually help everybody through the whole process. From our side, when dealers are posting to those clients, we'll still have to do that KYC, as well as any KYC that we would do if those clients selected our firm or any other firm as collateral. With that, I'll hand over to Judd. And
that's good. Thank you. I don't want to repeat much of what Dominic just mentioned, but custodians and asset service providers provide generally two lines of service as it pertains to uncleared margin rules. Some of our clients select us to become their collateral operations outsource provider. So we're the ones on their behalf calculating the initial margin and facing off against their counterparties, affecting the transfer of securities to meet the margin regulations. And then there's the custody side of the business where we offer collateral segregation services. That second bit is what the focus is here today. I guess I'm representing probably some of the smaller custodians that haven't been impacted, mainly because the types of clients that we support are entirely buy side. We don't have any sell side direct customers. And so what we're aiming to do is provide a service for the buy side. We think it's a natural fit for our clients to keep these accounts under one roof so we can effect transfers between one account to the other. So the starting point for us is to make sure that we have a standard account control agreement. And I think most people know, maybe I'm not sure if I can use that assumption, but ISDA has a legal working group where they've retained external counsel, and they're going through each of the major custodians, at least U.S. account control agreement, as well as UK account control agreement, and any other jurisdictions where their members are demanding them review these agreements. And custodians have been offering this type of service for a number of years, decades, either to support independent amounts or to support margin held for U.S. registered mutual funds under the 1940 Act. So there's a lot of familiarity around this service, and a lot of our clients already understand how it works and how these agreements function. The great benefit to a firm like us, and I think other custodians, is going through that legal process to vet your agreements would theoretically leave it to a better place where you're going to negotiate downstream with your clients and your dealers. There won't be too many negotiable points. We shouldn't see too much of a variation between one account control agreement and the next. What helps us with that is that ISDA panel is holding a bunch of representatives from the sell side and the buy side. So theoretically, we like to think through that that's going to help the process entirely for the account opening end of things. We don't see too many hurdles on our side. We can quantify the number of clients that we think are in scope and at what points. And we also have a view into which dealers they're trading with. So we have a good feel for how much business will come our way for these accounts. But what we are absolutely advising our clients is let's negotiate the account control agreements first. And the account opening process will be a trigger point down the road. And that's from the regulatory relief that we saw. I think that's a great relief, not only to the custodians, but to the asset owners, so they don't have to start paying for services that they don't need. So most custodians will charge for these accounts. It's like a nominal account charge or a basis point fee of the assets in there, but there typically is some kind of flat fee in there. If the accounts are going to sit there dormant, then there's really no point for the clients to have to pay fees. So what we expect and what we're going to advise our clients is, again, let's negotiate the account control agreement, so at least we get that out of the way. And then when you get close to that 50 million threshold, maybe it's 30, 35, 40, it's up to the client. They give us a 2-week notification time frame, and then we'll effect the opening and alert both parties that the account is open. So we do see practical means for carrying out these margin regulations, at least from account opening perspective. As I said before, the majority of our clients for these segregation services will be existing clients of our organization already. So that knocks out a lot of the AML KYC aspects. We are starting to get interest from non-custody clients of our organization, and I think it's because they might be facing a queue with their other provider or whatever reasons. So we are evaluating this, but one of the safeguards in play is if we already have that contractual relationship with that organization, we already are the custodian of their accounts, it's an easier solution for those organizations as opposed to supporting this from an instance where external transfers of assets come into the bank. Outside of that, there's, as I said before, the custodians have been providing this type of service in the past. One of the fears that I think the industry had is that right now it's a heavy paper-based flow. Secure email, faxes, dealers logging into custodian portals and things like that. I'm speaking for my organization. I think I'm speaking for a lot of other custodians. That's all going to move away. Most custodians, including my organization, are adhering to industry standards on how to automate these messages, whether it's through Swift or a utility. So there is relief by all parties. It does require testing between mainly the dealers, but also the large buy-side firms with the custodians to affect that. So just wanted to point that out, that it's a pain point historically, but that pain point should be going away, and it's for good reasons, not just to comply with margin regulations. The one challenge we see with the margin regulations, and it's already been discussed, so I'm not going to bang on this point too much, but is the eligibility rules and cash as a permissible asset. And for us as a custodian, it is forcing us to offer or to launch a treasury-only fund. With that, we don't have too much outside interest in a treasury-only fund from our clients. They're very comfortable with money market funds. So I think the only thing really driving this is so that clients of ours that wish to pledge initial margin as cash can continue to do so. Practically speaking, on our side, partnering up with our asset management firm, we're looking at how early that notification needs to come to us to move the cash. Whether it has to be first invested in a treasury fund and then transferred as an investment into that SEG account, or can it just come in the form of cash and be reinvested into that treasury fund? There are some operational hurdles that we as a custodian have to go through. There are certainly haircut calculation concerns that the dealers are facing when cash is permissible, on whether or not they apply a 0 haircut overnight, or is it a 8% haircut, 12% haircut? Got to look at the underlying fund. So there are complications now that that we all are wrestling with because of the eligibility rules and the reinvestment of cash as margin. I think that pretty much covers all of the things that I want to talk about. So I'll open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you very much. With that, I'm opening it up for questions or comments from panel members. In particular, have you yourselves experienced any particular challenges, either raised by our panelists or otherwise, with respect to custodial arrangements? And in the interest of being solution-driven, do you have any suggestions for ways to address some of those challenges? Can I open it up to people on the phone for any comments or questions for our panelists? I'm allowing for a louder pregnant pause because I was too quick on the draw the last two panels. Does anyone have views on steps custodians could be taking beyond what has already been highlighted that they are taking to help address some of the challenges around volumes for the next couple of phases? All right. Well, you guys did an excellent job. Very thorough. Apparently, you've got it all under control. So thank you very much for your time. And with that, we are going to shift to our next panel. Great. So now we're going to shift to cross-jurisdictional issues in the implementation of uncleared margin rules. And to present on this topic, we have Tara Cruz, who's the Global Head of Infrastructure, Data, and Non-Cleared Margin for ISDA.
Thank you to Commissioner Stump, Chairman, to the other commissioners, and the GMAC committee for having me today to speak on cross-jurisdictional issues with respect to the margin requirements. Although global regulators have based their margin requirements on the BCBS-IOSC framework, there are still differences that are causing challenges for market participants who are subject to requirements in multiple jurisdictions. In some cases, those variations are based on the party scope or the product scope, subject to that regulator's oversight, but nonetheless, that can cause complexity issues, cost issues, and level playing field issues for market participants. So let's look at a few of these today. First off, let's talk about ANA calculation. This has been brought up, but here's some of the differences that we're seeing in this world. There's differences in methodology, timing for the calculation period, as well as applicable compliance states. So in the US and Brazil, the average aggregate notional amount is based on a daily average of the gross amount of the derivatives over the count period, whereas the rest of the globe uses only the month-end totals. So 3 observations as opposed to 64 observations that were just required in the ANA calc period for the US for phase 5 that just completed. In terms of the count period itself, following the phase-in period, the US moves to a June to August material swaps exposure count period, whereas the rest of the globe stays with March to May. This means parties have to run 2 separate ANA calc periods and 2 separate periods of notification to their counterparties in the event they have a change in their status. That's especially challenging in cases, as was pointed out earlier, for separately managed accounts, where it may be difficult to aggregate the necessary information. Compliance dates as well. Finally, following the phase-in period, the US and EU moved to a calendar year compliance cycle, while the rest of the globe stays on a September-August cycle. These bifurcated dates create a lot of complexity. You can see here's the calendar through January of 2023, if you take into consideration all the different ANACAL and compliance date periods. If these dates were aligned, it's much more simple. Product scope. Differences in product scope add cost and complexity to cross-border compliance, as firms have to implement mechanisms to identify jurisdictional application and tag this on a trade-by-trade basis. Most parties use a higher of method to calculate a separate initial margin calculation for each jurisdiction and then settle the higher of amount. But in some jurisdictions like the EU and Japan, parties are allowed to use what we would refer to as a broad product set, meaning you can include products that are subject to non-cleared requirements in any jurisdiction in your calculation. Just to point out a couple of the differences that are highlighted here on this slide, the EU is an outlier for VM for physically settled FX swaps and forwards. We do expect them to resolve that in an upcoming amended regulatory technical standard. Also, the other one getting a lot of attention these days are equity options. Out of scope in the US, that's not the case in some other jurisdictions. The EU, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Korea all have delayed application of requirements to equity options at this point, but those expire in early next year. And many market participants are concerned about the impact of that, especially in terms of a level playing field between the US and the EU. Settlement timing. The US is most restrictive in terms of settlement timing with its T+1 requirement. This can be particularly problematic for counterparties trading between Asia and the US. It prevents parties from settling using some collateral that may take longer than T+1 to settle. And this is expected to be more problematic as we move into the final phases, where parties might be more likely to use the third-party custodial structures, and it may take more time to do the settlements. Eligible collateral. So when we have multiple jurisdictions involved, the parties have to agree an eligible collateral schedule that reflects the intersection of the collateral that's allowed in each of the relevant jurisdictions. This does create some restrictions on what's allowed to be used. The example that's been highlighted over and over today is money market funds. We do expect that because of the T+1 settlement requirement in the US, because of the US's requirement to reinvest cash that's used as collateral, and because of the use of more third-party custodians in the final phases, parties will want to use money market funds more. Unfortunately, there is a direct conflict in the rules between the US and the EU in terms of the conditions for money market funds. Repos and reverse repos are allowed to be used in the EU. They're not allowed in the US, for instance. In August, ISDA sent a letter on behalf of 6 industry associations asking US regulators to expand the types of money market funds that can be used as collateral, including allowing use of non-US money market funds. An equivalence determination from the USPRs in respect of the EU rules would also help mitigate the situation. Inter-affiliate IM. Currently, the USPRs are the only jurisdiction that requires inter-affiliate initial margin. That might change, of course, as a result of the rule that was put out earlier this week and approved, or last week, and approved by the FDIC and the OCC. The EU also has an intergroup IM requirement. It's on deferral until early next year, and they are currently looking at potentially extending that or hopefully eliminating it all. IM model governance. This has been touched on a bit today as well, following the comments that Raphael made and Wendy made on this topic. Just to baseline a bit, so ISDA conducts robust and regular testing of the ISDA SIM model with global dealers in order to prove that the model is regulatory compliant. And then in addition, the dealers that use SIM do regular internal back testing of the model to ensure that the IM amounts meet or exceed the regulatory requirements for all of their in-scope portfolios. Despite these efforts, some jurisdictions also impose individual model validation requirements and backtesting requirements on smaller counterparties who might lack the resources, expertise, or infrastructure to conduct such measures. That could impact swap dealers in the US that are in phases 5 or 6. But mostly the concern these days is about the EU requirements that apply, of course, to the broad spectrum of counterparties. And the concern is that those counterparties won't be able to use a risk-sensitive model like the SIM. Our estimates do show that the bulk of the counterparties who will come into scope in phase 5 and 6, or more counterparties from the EU and UK, will come into scope than from other jurisdictions. We are engaged with EU regulators on this matter to try to mitigate the impact. And although this discussion is on cross-jurisdictional initial margin margin issues, I would be remiss if I did not raise potential issues within the U.S. borders. The SEC, of course, did finalize its margin requirements recently. And although they did come a long way from their proposed rule to their final rule in terms of aligning with CFTC and USPR requirements, there are still some primary differences that are likely to cause challenges for market participants. First off, I'll mention party scope. So the SEC rules don't have an equivalent for the material swaps exposure level or the financial end user definition. Rather, they rely on a list of exemptions, like a commercial end user exemption. But this means there might be smaller counterparties not caught by US rules already who will be subject to SEC margin requirements. Also, security-based swap dealers are required to collect IM but not post IM, and there is no IM exchange between dealers. For some market participants, this is a welcome divergence, but it does create a good deal of complexity in terms of trying to figure out for parties in the US which transactions are in scope between swaps and security-based swaps, when you have to post and when you have to collect. One of my colleagues took a stab at trying to figure out what that logic looked like, and he came up with 32 variations that a swap dealer alone might have to look at to figure out when they might need to post or when they might need to collect for their swaps and security-based swaps. And that's not even taking into consideration MSPs. Next up, I'll mention segregation. So under the SEC rules, a party can elect third-party segregation, as we currently have, or omnibus segregation, or they can waive the segregation requirement altogether. The existing suite of IMCSAs is built on the third-party segregation model, so we would have to have new docs or new provisions for separate treatment of transactions under the SEC. It's not clear at this point how many counterparties will be eligible to take advantage of this opportunity if they are subject to a third-party segregation requirement in any other jurisdiction, including under USPR rules, then they may not be able to take advantage of this. Haircuts for collateral. The SEC has their own standardized set of haircuts for collateral, and they actually vary for standalone security-based swap dealers versus broker dealers. A security-based swap dealer can elect to apply these CFTC's haircuts, but broker-dealer security-based swap dealers have to use the SEC's haircuts for equity security-based swaps. So if a party is subject to the SEC, you might have to use the more punitive haircuts if they're more punitive than the others. IM calculation. The SEC rules don't use the BCBS IOSCA regulatory schedule for calculating IM. They don't use that same grid. Rather, they have distinct methods for IM calculation that are specified for each of broker-dealers and separate ones for standalone security-based swap dealers and separate ones for equity and separate ones for CDS. This would make it very difficult for their counterparties to replicate that initial margin amount to check the amount that they're being required to post. A broker-dealer can apply to use an IM model like SIM, but only for its non-equity security-based swaps. A standalone security-based swap dealer can apply to use an IM model like SIM for both equity and non-equity security-based swaps. Portfolio margining. Standalone security-based swap dealers can use a quantitative model like the SIM to portfolio margin equity security-based swaps and swaps, subject to further coordination with the CFTC. CFTC rules don't currently contemplate portfolio margining, but this approach was acknowledged in a staff letter from DSIO and DCR to ISDA back in 2016. So this is an area that we would look for the agencies to collaborate around, although there are potentially still challenges with being able to do this since there are limitations on the SEC side in terms of what can be portfolio margined, despite the fact that swaps and security-based swaps are being margined together on the USPR side. As was mentioned earlier, the SEC does have an alternative compliance mechanism. A standalone security-based swap dealer can elect to comply with the CFTC's margin rules for their security-based swaps, provided they are not clearing for clients and provided their security-based swaps don't exceed the specified margins. It's yet unclear how many security-based swap dealers will be eligible for this alternative. An effective way to mitigate the cross-jurisdictional margin issues is via international deference or even deference or even domestic deference. But to date, substitute compliance is available in very limited cases. I would certainly encourage U.S. and global regulators to prioritize equivalence determinations to help simplify this complex world of cross-border margining.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cruz, for taking an already complex topic and helping distill some of the key issues that can be fruit for further discussion. So on that, we have a lot of GMAC members who have operations in multiple jurisdictions. So I'm interested in people's perspectives on what are some of the most challenging aspects from your firm's perspective with respect to some of these jurisdictional differences. And furthermore, are there any suggestions you would have either consistent with what ISDA has already presented or any other suggestions to help mitigate some of those differences? Ms. Guest?
I think one of the things that we'd appreciate the Commission to focus on is the settlement timing. The T+1, 2, 3, 4, 5 promptly differences are not only challenging because of the fact that different jurisdictions have different requirements, but also when you have operations in multiple jurisdictions, you're running certain operational processes at a particular time of day. There are cutoffs for those processes. There are all kinds of logistical things that happen operationally within firms, let alone bringing in the complexity of the custodians and if you have instructions that have to pass. And so I think the T+1 requirement is one that a lot of folks probably appreciate the Commission taking a look at.
Thank you, Ms. Guest. On the phone, do we have any comments or questions either for our panelists or on the general topic of cross-border challenges and potential solutions? Mr. Yamada?
I think that was an extremely illuminating presentation on many of the different inconsistencies and frankly things that I guess from the dealer perspective we consider many of the operations, not necessarily see some of the impacts on users. Quite illuminating to see how complex, how dispersed this is. I mean, our mandate here, panel, definitely bears additional scrutiny because just the number of line items that you identified, you can see that implementation is just, I mean, it's going to be a practical nightmare. So perhaps, you know, in the course of the implementation and the roadmaps and the timelines, we should also attempt to, I guess, increase that harmonization globally. And I guess also perhaps take a look at prioritizing, to Commissioner Contenza's original point, more in a risk-based approach. Where are the real systemic risks associated with many of these, and which ones are quite irrelevant and just enough? That might be something we.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury?
Tara, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about how the SIM model was developed and the governance and the involvement of actual regulators in that model, since I think it's a pretty central part of this whole risk reduction system we've put in place.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think when the rules were being developed and people knew what the landscape was in terms of what the requirements were going to be, it became clear fairly quickly that having multiple models or each dealer having a different model, each counterparty using a different model was just not tenable. Parties would not be able to replicate the calculations that parties were making, because of course you are calculating the amount that you're asking your party to post to you. So how can they replicate that? How can they dispute it? So the industry came together to say, it's just not possible. We can't support many, many different models. There's a huge value to having a standardized model that we can all apply, where it's transparent. So I can calculate what I'm posting to you. I can calculate what I'm asking you to post to me, and we have that check in place. It needs to be transparent. Also, there is clearly a lot of work involved in developing a model and maintaining a model, and to have many, many parties having to replicate this over and over again just simply isn't supported. So the industry came together and came to ISDA and worked together through the thought leadership of many of the major industry participants to hold together ideas in terms of what would be a workable solution for calculating initial margin, and an approach that would balance having appropriate risk coverage that aligned with the requirements, but also not having the model be too complex, because it was important that people could calculate quickly, and that it could be approachable for a variety of market participants. Once you've got it set up and you have the inputs, you can actually calculate SIM on a spreadsheet, right? As was mentioned earlier, it's really the setup and the data that you need that's the most complex part, not the model itself. And to date, yes, I mean, the model is being used across the board by almost all market participants that have phased in. And it's appropriately conservative to meet global regulatory requirements. There was broad engagement with regulators, especially in the EU and the US and Japan early on, in terms of the development of the SIM, to make sure that it was going to be satisfactory to regulators. And we have continued engagement with regulators as we monitor quarterly the performance of SIM and send out reports across the globe to assure everyone that, in fact, the model continues to perform as expected.
Thank you. Ms. Bellett?
I echo the comments that were made about how well this kind of lays out the complexity at a high level. Because I think in this, or most other banks agree that there are from each of these issues beyond just what we see here. Kind of turning to the product scope, I'm just wondering if you can offer a little bit more detail around, for example, and I know that from a dealer's perspective, one of the is not only the regulatory arbitrage discussed earlier, but also how that kind of leads to ongoing issues or resolution perspective. So, for example, if there are issues where dealers are even different product for under a meter, right? How that on.
Yeah, we certainly do see that come up when we seek information from parties about disputes that they have in relation to their IM amounts. What they indicate primarily is that there's not an issue with calculation of the initial margin amount. Not so often it's an issue about the inputs. It's often about the portfolio. It's about the trades that each party has put into the portfolio to do their IM calculation. Those are the differences that they see and have to resolve in order to get to the right IM calculation. And so sometimes that's a determination. Is it a swap? Is it a security-based swap? There seems to be areas where there is a lack of consistency. Is it an equity option? Is it not? I mean, these are fundamental issues that do come up as part of our SIM governance forum that helps do the maintenance of the SIM model. Parties do sometimes raise these issues about product scope, and we try to look at it and provide guidance where appropriate. But at the end of the day, there are inconsistencies. We do encourage people to prepare ahead of time and test with their counterparties before they go live, because that's often a good opportunity to identify where you might be identifying a product differently than your counterparty, and therefore would bring it into scope differently than they would when you begin to calculate your initial margin. Any other questions for Ms. Cruz, or any other comments around cross-border complexities and the impacts on business? On the phone, anything else? Great, we'll now take a break for lunch. Thank you. Could we get back to business? There are any GMAC members in the near proximity of this conference room? Please come to the table. Great. So before we get to our last panel, I just wanted to raise an additional piece of business, really to follow up from the very helpful and detailed panels we had this morning on our first deep dive topic, which was margin. It seemed like there was a great deal of wonderful insights from a number of our panelists, as well as open issues for consideration that would be very helpful to discuss in a smaller subcommittee of the GMAC if there is an appetite to set that up. And the idea would be to set up, the commission would set up a subcommittee of the GMAC, which could consist of both members of the GMAC and non-members, to really take a deeper dive and look at some of the issues in advance of Phase 5 and Phase 6 that the industry is grappling with, and help formulate some recommendations to give to the commission in a more formalized way than we have been able to do, and dig deeper than we were able to do this morning, as well as in the prior GMAC. So I know that Commissioner Stump is in favor of at least me raising this topic with you. So I open it up for discussion if people think that that would be a worthy subcommittee to recommend to the CFTC to set up. Any thoughts? Mr. Yamada?
Would most certainly be supportive of that and would love to participate.
Any other thoughts on the idea? Ms. Bradbury?
I would be supportive too. My understanding is that we would want to do this relatively soon.
Ideally, the idea would be to capitalize on the momentum from this morning's discussions, as well as previous discussions, suggestions already raised to the CFTC, and get a group of industry participants to quickly act upon some of those recommendations to formalize them for the CFTC. If there's no further discussion, would anyone like to make a motion?
Thank you. Yeah, so I would move that the GMAC recommend to the commission that it consider creating a subcommittee on uncleared margin, or margin for uncleared swaps.
Wonderful. Any second to that motion, Ms. Bradbury?
Yeah, I would second that motion.
Excellent. All in favor, please raise your hand. We have a unanimous approval of that motion. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll go on to our next panel and our next topic. So our final panel of the day is going to be focused on EMIR 2.2 and the ESMA consultation. We have 3 presenters on this topic. Sean Downey, the Executive Director of Global Clearing and Risk Policy for the CME Group. Carolyn Van Den Dalen, the Head of Regulation and Compliance for IceClear Europe. And Jackie Mesa, Chief Operating Officer and Senior Vice President of Global Policy for the FIA. I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I will lead off with some background on the EMIR 2.2 and the ESMA consultations. But first, I want to thank Commissioner Stump, the rest of the commissioners of the CFTC and CFTC staff, in particular, Andre Goldsmith, for setting all of this up. So with no further ado, I'll start with a little bit of background. The origination of the topic that we're discussing right now really started in June of 2016 when the UK referendum occurred and the UK voted to leave the European Union. I'll note that that vote occurred about 10 days after most US CCPs received recognition under the previous European regime. And in July of 2017, about a year later, the original European Commission proposal was released to revamp and overhaul the regime for non-EU CCPs in Europe, at the time with a focus on European monetary policy and the clearing of the euro. Following the 2017 release, over the next 2 years, the European Commission, European Council, and European Parliament negotiated the text of EMIR 2.2 and reached a political agreement in March of 2019. And we expect that it would be published in the official journal by the end of 2019, so in the next few months. Following the agreement on EMIR 2.2, the next step is to issue a delegated act with regulatory text covering 3 topics. Those topics include tiering, which is effectively the assessment of a non-EU CCP to determine whether it is systemically important; comparable compliance, which focuses on the ability of a systemically important CCP to rely on its home jurisdiction's regulations to, quote unquote, meet the European requirements; and finally, fees, which cover the fees necessary and proposed by the European Commission to cover the expansion of ESMA to oversee non-EU CCPs. There was a consultation that ESMA issued on these 3 topics in May of 2019, which closed in July of 2019. And I think each of the panelists will be covering some of the responses to those consultations. To go into a little bit more detail, the results of the tiering analysis, which will be finalized by the European Commission, we expect in early 2020, will be putting non-EU CCPs in 2 buckets. One bucket is Tier 1, which will effectively be treatment similar to what non-EU CCPs have today in Europe with some additional data sharing. And Tier 2, which features the direct application of European regulations to a non-EU CCP that is deemed systemically important. From a criteria perspective, EMIR 2.2 created 5 criteria for the evaluation of whether a non-EU CCP is systemically important in Europe. As you can see, it focuses on, in most cases, the impact of that non-EU CCP in Europe, ranging from the potential impact of a failure, the extent of its clearing European-denominated products, European clearing member participation in its markets, and its relationships with EU financial institutions. That EMIR 2.2 criteria is what ESMA then took in its consultations, which we'll go into more detail in shortly, and expanded upon it to propose more detailed requirements to evaluate whether or not a CCP is systemically important in Europe. And that's what constitutes the tiering consultation. As I mentioned before, there are 2 other consultations that we'll address, but primarily it will be tiering and the comparable compliance asthma consultation. With that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn to discuss the next slide in more detail.
Sure, thank you. So again, my name is Carolyn, and I'm the head of regulation and compliance for ICE Clear Europe. ICE Clear Europe is just one of ICE's 6 geographically diverse clearinghouses, and we serve global markets and customers in North America, Europe, and Asia. Each of these clearinghouses is subject to the direct oversight of our local domestic regulators, often in close coordination with and communication with other regulatory authorities with vested interests. And we're also reflective of the G20 reforms and the CPMI IOSCO principles. Just by way of background, ICE Clear Europe, which clears markets located in the US, the UK, Europe, as well as OTC credit trades, is directly regulated by the CFTC, the SEC, the Bank of England, and the College of National Competent Authorities in Europe, which is already an EMIR construct. And so with the tiering proposal and the binding level 2 tax that will come into force in the coming weeks and months, we are now starting to explore how ESMA will deem a CCP either tier 1 or tier 2. So on the slide before you, you have the 5 categories that Sean mentioned. Those are in the green boxes at the top. And then underneath that, you can see that there is a variety of text which has 14 different indicators that ESMA has drafted in their consultation paper, which are the items that ESMA will assess when they are examining a CCP to be either tier 1 or tier 2. I think it's important to note that the determination of the tier of a CCP has important legal consequences as well. Once you are deemed tier 1 or tier 2, then you are only legally allowed to provide clearing services into Europe. Without that authority, it is illegal for a CCP to provide access to its clearinghouse to European clearing members and European end clients. And so I think when we're looking at these criteria, it's very important to think not only how does it impact the clearinghouse, but how it impacts the clearing members and their European clients. So our intention is not to walk through the 14 indicators, but I think Sean and I and Jackie would like to just highlight certain of those. So the first indicator that I'd like to highlight is indicator 1, assess the non-EU CCP's ownership, business, and corporate structure. And what ICE identified with this indicator is a general theme that we see through some of the other indicators, which is a misunderstanding or a lack of a nexus as to how this indicator actually determines a CCP's systemic impact on EU financial stability. In fact, when we look at this indicator, a CCP's ownership, business, or corporate structure is more something that a CCP would provide information to its regulator once it's approved or authorized to provide services and on a supervisory basis. But we struggle to see how ownership and business and corporate structure impacts a systemic impact on EU financial stability.
Just going to highlight a few of the broader concerns. FIA was able to file a letter to ESMA for their consultation, and I wanted to highlight a few overarching themes, read detail. Something Carolyn said is each indicator should have a nexus to the systemic risk of the EU or EU member state. If you do look through each indicator, you may struggle to find the next systemic risk. Additionally, the indicators are fairly broad. I think there's a couple of issues with the broadness of the indicators. One is it leaves a lot of latitude to the assessment, so ESMA. That may be okay, but then you're going to constantly be questioning, are we being assessed similarly to our competitors or to the next CCP? So I think the indicators being too broad may lead to some questions about fairness. Additionally, I think the broad nature of the indicators leaves
or lacks legal certainty for the CCPs being assessed. So you would definitely want fees being assessed to be able to determine ahead of time whether they may or may not be in category of tier 2. And I think if you look across the indicators, you probably would have no idea how you would be assessed based on the broad range of indicators. We made a few suggestions. One of them is to probably tier, sorry to use that word, or prioritize the indicators. So which ones are really important and which ones are less important. Tier level 1 does not indicate that they can't do that prioritization, so we suggest they do. Additionally, beyond prioritization, they should also consider using examples. So I think if you look at ownership, what are you concerned about on ownership? And giving some examples would help the industry in making their own assessment.
Thank you. And I think I'll just expand a little bit on both of the prior comments. It was noted, for example, in Indicator 1 that the non-EU CCP's ownership, business, and corporate structure is not necessarily relevant to whether it's systemic in the EU. We certainly agree with that and would expand on it. I was sitting before I was about to present on this panel, and I went through each of the indicators, and I underlined all of the language that we thought didn't have an EU nexus and wasn't a true test of systemic importance in Europe. And I ended up underlining parts of every single indicator, so I'm not going to go through all of them. However, you can continue on that path if you look, for example, even at Indicator 2, it starts off with an EU nexus discussing the clearing obligation and EU currency denomination, but then it talks about the complexity, price volatility, and average maturity of the instruments cleared. Again, if that EU nexus doesn't exist as a predicate, the fact that there's complexity, price volatility, or the maturity of those instruments isn't really relevant to determining whether a non-EU CCP is systemic in Europe. The same thing would be true if you look at Indicator 5, the risk profile of a non-EU CCP, transparency in Indicator 4. You could go on, but I think the primary issue that we're identifying is if you look at the EMIR 2.2 text, we interpreted it to suggest and require an evaluation of non-EU CCPs, keeping the impact of those non-EU CCPs on Europe in mind. And unfortunately, the ESMA consultations, from our perspective, have not followed that approach and have created an expansive, somewhat vague set of indicators for the evaluation of systemic importance in Europe. And we think that that's not good for non-EU CCPs, for the global markets, or for our participants. And so we have some concerns about the tiering consultation from that perspective.
And just building on those comments, it's important to note that in the level 1 text, which is binding law today, there is an obligation for ESMA to make the criteria objective and transparent. And as Sean and Jackie noted, when you look at this criteria and the indicators under each category, that objectivity and transparency doesn't always exist. So for Indicator 6, where it says assess the non-EU CCP's margin, default fund contributions, and eligible collateral, we would agree that is important for ESMA to look at when they are assessing the tier of a particular CCP. However, without that objectivity and that transparency into what they're actually looking at in terms of margin and default fund contributions, it's difficult to assess how they will apply consistently tier the different CCPs who have different default fund contribution setups and margin requirements.
And if I can just add one point on that particular indicator, and that goes to the previous comment about EU nexus that we've all made. There's no tying of the variation margin, the initial margin, the default fund, to the EU in this indicator. It looks at it from an aggregate perspective. And from our view, and I think from others' view, the fact that you have a certain amount of initial margin or have certain variation flows in US dollar or some other currency that doesn't necessarily have an EU nexus isn't really relevant to the evaluation of systemic importance. So once again, for this Indicator 6, we think it should be tied to this point about EU nexus.
And finally, Jackie made a good point about using numerical tests or quantitative assessments. And I think that what is missing in some of these indicators is relativity, and not looking at numbers in the absolute. So just for example, the total amount of initial margin denominated in euro, so having that European nexus held across all 6 of the ICCPs is just over 19 billion euro, which is only 0.12% of the total EU economy. So it just shows you can look at a number as big as 19 billion, but in the scale of the EU economy, that's a very small percentage.
The next proposal was on comparable compliance. This is really how the EU will judge whether they rely on home country regulation or EMIR requirements will apply. Under the ESMA's proposal, the comparable compliant assessment will be conducted on a CCP level. That's different than the current equivalent assessment, which is done on a jurisdictional level. It's by requirement, a mapping of the non-EU requirement to the corresponding EMIR requirement. The supervisory approach on how ESMA would actually eventually supervise the third country CCP as Tier 2 is still a little bit vague and remains unclear. But there are core requirements they put forward in the consultation response and non-core requirements. The list of core requirements gets different kind of assessment. It will be considered comparable when they are always equal or at least strict or conservative as the corresponding EMIR core requirement. And if it's not the case, then EMIR will apply. So if it's a quantitative, so something that of course requires a number, it has to be as strict as the EMIR requirement. And if it's a qualitative assessment, it has to be as conservative as the EMIR requirement. For non-core requirements, it has to be similar to the corresponding EMIR non-core requirements if they substantially achieve the respective regulatory objectives of EMIR. Comparable compliance, they say even if the requirement by requirement doesn't match the EMIR requirement, they would then look at whether the requirement achieves the regulatory objectives of the corresponding EMIR requirements and effectively reflect the union's interest as a whole. I think that I use the exact words because I think that's left up to what you think it might mean. I take that to mean an objective-based outcomes, but it's a little hard to reconcile how they would do a requirement by requirement assessment and then at the end do an overall objective requirement. So I think you are one or the other, and to me, it's hard to have both the same proposal.
Sure. So just to expand upon the second line on the slide, which talks about the lack of clarity on the supervisory approach. In the consultation papers, it's noted that ESMA would presumably limit its supervisory authority to only those EMIR requirements for which ESMA cannot find a comparable requirement in the third country regime. However, 2 paragraphs after that, there's a statement by ESMA that regardless of the comparable compliance assessment, ESMA retains full supervisory powers over a Tier 2 CCP. So when a CCP is looking to apply to ESMA and to have the tiering and comparable compliance assessment, that's a cost that we have to analyze. And if there is a chance that ESMA will become a full supervisory authority, then that is something we have to add into the question as to whether we want to offer our services into Europe.
And just to add one more point on this slide, and I think it's an important one that Jackie touched on. The concept of comparable compliance, as she mentioned, is one of outcomes basis. It's one of evaluation of a regulatory regime to determine whether it's comparable. As drafted right now, and agree that the text is not entirely clear, the idea that you would always have to be equal to or at least as strict or conservative as a corresponding EMIR requirement, and if you are not, apply EMIR as a floor, effectively undermines or eliminates the whole concept of comparable compliance. And the reason being that if you think about it from a quantitative perspective, you could have a regime in 2 different jurisdictions which have slight differences and are equivalent overall, or one is even more conservative in most cases. But in some small cases, that regime is not as conservative, and as a result, you're applying the EMIR requirement either directly or as a floor, no matter what, because it's impossible effectively to always be at least as strict or conservative if you have two different requirements and two different regimes. So effectively, what that language does is it eliminates the concept of comparable compliance as currently drafted.
And I'll just add that hearing what Sean just said is, what are our concerns about having a regime of this nature? And it's really, we don't see how it can't cause anything but contradictory requirements, duplicative supervision, and a conflict between multiple CCP regulators during a time of crisis. And it's these negative consequences that will ultimately lead to market fragmentation and thus real economic harm. This fragmentation could lead to higher costs for commercial firms, for financial institutions, and for their customers. And they may also limit the jurisdictions that CCPs choose to operate in, thus reducing the access to important markets for clearing members and the clients that they currently benefit from. And ultimately, what does this result in? Again, it's a decrease in liquidity that's needed for the well-functioning and safe markets that we have today.
Just to finish this up with the timeline, currently EMIR 2.2 actually can't become applicable until these requirements or regulatory requirements level 2 are complete. It's level 1, which is the legislation, is not yet published in the official journal, which it has to be before level 2 is then issued. We expect that to come before the end of the year. Once that's done, ESMA will issue its technical advice, which is what we're considering on right now, to the European Commission on EMIR 2.2. We think that will, the three of us, by the way, in creating this timeline, not only looked at what was in the consultation and what's been said publicly, but then information that we've been gathering. So this is our own, a little bit of our own intel. We think that ESMA probably will issue its technical advice again before the end of the year, right after that is published in the official journal. Then what has to happen is the European Commission issues a delegated act, and that's sort of the final step for these level 2 regulations. And the delegated act is really what will govern. They have to allow 3 months for the European Parliament or the European Council to object under the called the Better Regulation Agenda. It's public sort of consultation, but it's really for the political bodies to weigh in. And that will probably happen end of this year, early next year. And then determinations will start happening for non-US CCPs. We think this whole process, at that point, could take 18 months before EMIR requirements kick in for non-EU CCPs. Again, our best. Thank you.
It's hard these days working at a London-based institution to not mention Brexit. So even though Jackie just described the relevant timelines for the world as it is today, our world in the UK will change, presumably, come the 31st of October. So operating under the assumption that there is a no-deal situation, and there could be a deal that's made, but I do not have a crystal ball, so I can't tell you that. But operating under the assumption that there is a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. Last year, the European Commission, in conjunction with ESMA, granted temporary recognition for the UK-based CCPs, including ICE Clear Europe, and thus we are allowed to offer our services into Europe until the end of March 2020. So there's a time gap between the end of October and the end of March. However, CCPs have notice periods for termination in the event that it becomes illegal to offer our services in Europe. ICE Clear Europe has a 30 business day notice of termination if we need to cut off access to EU clearing members. Other clearinghouses in London have as high as a 90 calendar day termination period. So that really brings us to around mid to end of December, when the CCPs will need to have clarity as to how we will operate once the temporary recognition ends at the end of March 2020. So as you can see, that's a very short time frame between the end of October, when the no deal happens, and then December, when we would potentially need to terminate members. And during that time frame, there's a few actions that can be taken. First, the European Commission and ESMA can extend our recognition and give us more time. Or alternatively, we can walk through the steps that Jackie just described and complete all of these legislative steps by mid-December, which I think would be trying.
But nevertheless, that's something that we hope can happen so that we have resolution and our clearing members have certainty that they can continue to use our services.
And if I could just make one final statement, just to flip that a little bit, there's an assumption potentially that a no-deal Brexit could occur October 31st, and Carolyn laid out the timeline and implications there. Of course, on the other side of the coin, there is the possibility that it's extended for 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it may be. In that case, the end result could potentially be a situation where U.S. CCPs actually are the only CCPs that are third country, at least from a size perspective, as far as we can tell, that may be subject to all of the steps that are laid out here. And so obviously that's potentially a perverse result from this new legislation and the ongoing political dialogue to be the U.S. being caught in a position as being non-EU and being subject to all of these new requirements, but no other CCPs are. And so there's kind of two potential timelines. I think both of them are negative, and they could impact different jurisdictions differently.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have any questions or comments for our panelists first in the room? Mr. Catino.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our panelists for an effective presentation. I think I'll be brief. There are two things. One, we've expressed our concerns with respect to the tiering. And if you look at the indicators, I hope what comes through, based on what we see publicly, is that ESMA's technical advice deviates substantially from the spirit of the 5 critical factors that determine steering. So it's important to see, I think, some level of certainty that any rules that are put in place is in fact addressing the nexus with the EU, whether it be union currency products or members based in EU. And the exposures that they have. The second thing, in the absence of that, we are left to assume the worst. We are left to assume that Tier 2 is what would arbitrarily be applied. And in those circumstances, our concerns, as you've noticed, as you've heard today from the panel, is about comparable compliance. And it completely disregards the equivalence agreement that is already in place. And in fact, it presents significant conflicts. And from our perspective, I'll speak from a risk management perspective, significant conflicts. We can take two simple cases. One is individual segregation. So individual segregation cannot be offered in the United States. We keep our account standards are gross and legally segregated but operationally commingled. The second issue that we have is when we think of default management. So when we've managed risk in the past, we have a strong history and a long one of porting our non-defaulting clients to solvent FCMs. And we've been able to do that because our regulations in the US have afforded us the flexibility of moving our clients to a safe home in the event that we face an issue like this. Under European law, that's not possible. In fact, it requires a clearinghouse to get the explicit consent of each one of its clients and a determination as to their end destination. And we don't think that is a workable solution. I've just referred to two issues where it presents risks. If we were to go further, our concerns would be in the ability of a clearinghouse to administer margins. So our ability to actually cover our risk exposures when we see them. Today under CFTC rules, we have a great set of principles that apply not only to a clearinghouse, but to our clearing firms. and in the way our clearing firms administer margins when it comes to their clients. All of that is under risk when Tier 2 regulations are applied.
Thank you. Commissioner Quintens?
Yes, thank you. I just had a quick question, Caroline. Given all of the steps that need to occur regulatorily and legislatively, and the window that you described from a notice period perspective, do you believe it's basically a certainty that there will need to be an extension of the exemptions?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think it's highly likely that an extension will be needed. And we have heard recently, and I know there have been press articles about this, that temporary recognition could be extended. But the more time we have with that knowledge, the better, not only for the clearinghouse, but also for the clearing members. Because if we don't know about this temporary recognition being extended until later in the game, then clearing members may have to take proactive steps to find another clearinghouse, tell their end client. So again, while I think that it's likely and I'm not certain, the more time, the better.
Just to elaborate on what Carolyn said, I think even though a clearinghouse may issue a notice 90 days before termination, which would actually be in December, so we're getting close, clearing members do start already. They don't wait for the termination notice to show up at their doorstep, but they already start planning alternatives. So the longer that goes into November, really the scarier that becomes.
Mr. Horkin?
Thank you. And I really want to offer my thanks to the commissioners for taking this leadership role on cross-border regulations and seeking. So thank you. On behalf of LCH, which operates clearinghouses both in the EU and outside, it's clearly important. And as we operate the largest interest rate swap clearinghouse for clients and members in 6 jurisdictions, it's critical for us that we have clarity on the rules and regulations in the jurisdictions that we are part of, including being directly registered with the CFTC proudly the last. And we submitted, our parent company, LSEG, submitted a comment letter on July 30th that really talked about a couple of things that I think the panel members are articulated in an outline today. One, on the tiering, really need clarity measurement against these indicators, as well as a prioritization again for them, as Caroline said. And secondly, on the comparable, I believe it should be an outcome approach opposed to requirement. So we would definitely like to see clarity on that and submitted a comment letter accordingly. In Tenz's question, we do think an extension would be likely, certainly welcomed, both by the market to avoid fragmentation, provide certainty to our members and clients that we will continue to offer service that we do. And to date, we've seen no change in client behavior due to that lack of knowledge, but we would ask all regulators to eliminate.
Thank you. Mr. Weechen?
Thanks, Angie. Actually, a question for the panel. What is your understanding of the role of the ECB or the other European central banks of issue under EMIR 2.2?
Sure, I'll take that, and then feel free to expand. But the way that the EMIR 2.2 text is drafted, we understand that the ECB and other central banks of issue would have powers in emergency situations to express and require CCPs to take certain action in regard to margins, liquidity risk management, and other risk management tools. I believe those powers are designed to last for 6 months once they take action, and then they have the ability after those 6 months to extend as necessary. We also understand, and this is informally rather than within the text, that there is an expectation that they would be able to weigh in and express their views informally. And in addition, they are, I believe, observers, but maybe not voting members of the supervisory colleges that are going to be constructed as part of this non-EU CCP construct for Tier 2 CCPs.
Yes, that's correct. That's my understanding as well. And as Sean said, the ECB does sit as a non-voting member of our EMIR.
So DTCC, we actually filed a letter in response to the tiering release 2. We're clearing and settlement service provider for the cash markets, not derivatives markets. But one of the things we raised in our comment letter in response to the release was this issue around the involvement of the central banks, both over in Europe, but as well as here in the United States. And I think part of the reason why we raised it was just to be very open and honest about it. I'm not sure, and I haven't been convinced that the central banking community in Europe has fully thought through, or those who are making this policy on behalf of the central banking community in Europe have fully thought this through. And I don't know whether the European-based CCPs have a view on this, but if you designate a non-EU CCP as Tier 2, then necessarily you're going to involve not just the market regulators, but the central banks of two different countries. So in other words, we have obviously a number of SIGCOs and SIFMOs here in the United States, and if the same designation under EMIR 2.2, a Tier 2 status comes into force in the EU, then you have a very difficult situation where you have central banks in their role as supervisors, but also the providers of emergency tools in some kind of potential conflict about who's going to do what. And that's a very, very difficult position, I think, to put central banks in. So we all have our relationships, fondness for the CFTC and the other market regulators, but the central banks, I think, are a really important part of the policymaking here, and something that I haven't been convinced has been thought about as much as it should be. Not so much on the part of policymakers here, but obviously those making the policies, in this case, EMIR 2.2 over in Europe. So just wanted to raise that point here.
Thank you. Ms. Bradbury, do you have a comment? Mr. Yamada?
Actually, I would echo those comments. As we recently saw the letter, I guess, reestablishing a more collaborative and cooperative attitude. I think that was heartening, but the practical concern is even if we do have some clarity around what's very clearly not a clear set of restrictions under with respect to who is or beholden to which regimes, you can see a situation where in times of stress you have multiple different regulators and central banks instituting somewhat conflicting policies, and frankly that resulting in an increase rather than a decrease in system. And a lot of conclusion and more trapped capital and more restrictions around resolving some of the issues we face with counterparty liquidity, and ending up tying us in knots a little bit. And that's a little bit of concern from our perspective. We do see a little bit of that happening. We have seen that in the past. Again, to the extent that regulators are cooperating, trying to rationalize and not duplicating effort, that will do a lot to resolve that. But you can quickly see a situation where that there's gridlock because of multiple conflicting and not ill-intentioned, but just conflicting requirements from regulator bodies, which frankly, on a day-to-day basis, have not necessarily been relevant.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller?
My name is Eric Müller. I'm the CEO of Eurex Clearing, so I represent a CCP that's based in the EU. And I can echo some of the points that were made here. The CCPs operate global businesses. Our markets are global, especially if you look into the derivatives markets. It may not be as pronounced in some of the other markets, but certainly in the derivatives markets, these are global in nature. So I think it's really important that regulators globally find a way cooperating. There needs to be global cooperation in managing these situations and oversight. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that Europe, as far as I see it, has been probably taking it, to the extreme in terms of granting equivalent. So if we as a European CCP want to do business in the US, there's no question you get a license for it. And our experience with the CFTC has been a good one, and I can confirm what was said previously by LCH. So it's possible, even if there are different rules that apply and in Europe, to comply with other regimes. And I'd like to counter some of the potential impression you might get from regulations in Europe from one of the previous speakers, and as it regards segregation models, etc. I think they're just different. You could make the case that individual segregation is a stronger form of segregation, especially if you look at the end clients, than is the model available in the US. But there is a background to it, and it's enshrined in the laws in the US and goes to the bankruptcy regimes that are different in each of these countries. So what I'm trying to get at is there are ways to navigate these differences, and we have to find these ways. And I can only encourage both the CFTC but also the EU Commission to find ways that allow US CCPs to continue to do business in Europe, but also the European CCPs to continue to do business in the US, as these markets are truly global. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mesa?
I just want to pick up on a point on the central bank point. The numerous hands, as they say, on the steering wheel in a crisis cause greater systemic concern. I think what's critical here is probably the MOU. If a CCP in a certain jurisdiction is tier 2 CCP, then what will happen is there will be a negotiation of MOU. And hopefully the regulator in that third country will negotiate all of that ahead of time through an MOU. The issue, though, is that what remains in the law, level 1 of EMIR 2.2, is a potential for relocation. That remains. It's not being talked about anymore because there's been assurances that it won't be used. But I think, cleverly, if they're not perhaps getting what they need out of that jurisdiction and that regulator, there's always the threat that will remove that clearing. So just keep back in minds that I think this is a huge, who does have control in a crisis, and what does that look like? It's really important for the industry to know that ahead of time. Who are they going to answer to? And speaking, I guess, on behalf of the clearing member community, if they're getting instructions, particularly for the CCP, who might be getting different calls for different things, clearing member community, if they're getting different calls to do different things from different regulators, that sounds like a nightmare.
Mr. Downey?
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points as well. It is true that cooperation will be important, and that hopefully we can find ways where different jurisdictions have different regulatory requirements, that those can be reconciled and that there's a path forward. But we should also remember that each jurisdiction creates a regulatory regime based on its local markets, its local legal requirements, and its local banking regulations. And so an example of that would be, we understand in Europe there's been a focus on the reinvestment of cash collateral, and that's likely due to the historic depositor protection in Europe. In the US, our friends both at the CFTC and the Fed have spent a lot more time focusing on liquidity risk management. And so the approach to collateral and the approach to managing liquidity is different in the two regulatory regimes. And we think that's probably appropriate. And that's an example of where you could get to a conflict and be in a situation where you undermine stability because each regime has taken an approach that's appropriate for its overall legal regime and its regulatory regime. And we think it's important to remember that and not just assume that overlaying regulations on top of each other will create a better result. I also just wanted to point out, from the perspective of the CFTC, it is not true that if you're a non-US CCP, you necessarily have to register. In the entire exchange-traded derivatives market, you actually do not need to register to offer foreign futures to US persons. So I just want to clarify that point because I think it might have been lost in the previous statement.
Mr. Coutinho?
Sean took some of my words away, so I'll have the second point. Eric is right. Individual seg may not present financial risks to us, but I was simply pointing out that it presents a legal risk to us. So risks in general, we'll talk about legal and financial.
Commissioner Stump?
I actually was going to ask a question about the offering of futures, but I'll take it a different direction. I would like for the panel to maybe elaborate on the idea that, because I think oftentimes people in the public are not quite as aware that the conversation over the past few years has been almost exclusively centered on OTC swaps. So the discussions we've had at the CFTC with our counterparts in various jurisdictions have been focused on OTC swap. So to the extent that a US-based CFTC-registered DCO has been offering futures in the commodity space for years, whether it's crude oil or cotton, how might that be impacted should a US CCP deem Tier 2? And how might those particular end users and their clearing members be impacted?
I can start with answering that question. So the most obvious potential impact, and this again goes back to market structure and legal and regulatory regime, is the fact in the US, primarily and I think exclusively, frankly, for commodities, agriculture, and energy, there's an ability to collateralize via letters of credit. So our participants, for example, who are in the agricultural space, have the ability to deposit letters of credit to meet their collateral requirements with us because for whatever reason they may not be natural holders of US treasuries or US dollar cash or whatever it may be. Our view is that that's developed over a long time period, and it's very important in particular for the US agricultural markets. And so that is probably the most obvious direct example of a potential impact on US markets and on US participants in the commodity space. There are others. Any potential where you have two different regulatory regimes increase costs and makes access likely or potentially more expensive. But I think the primary potential and the most clear potential issue is in that letters of credit and the ability to use that as collateral.
Another potential downstream effect on clearing members and clients could just be that with the increased supervision from a new regulator, longer lead times to implement new products and new margin models, or changes to products and changes to margin models, which could potentially be not what a clearing member wants if the margin model is more efficient. So I think for that, it's something you have to consider again when you want to add a new regulator.
And another question for our panel: what kind of feedback have you been getting from your own clients around these proposals? We've heard a lot about your perspectives and potential impacts on your clients, but have you been engaging with your clients? Have they been engaged on this topic, and what kind of feedback have they given you?
So Our engagement has primarily been at the association level. So Jackie, for example. So primarily FIA and ISDA. We've engaged with both of those associations. And I think as reflected in the comments that they provided, I think there is a recognition that regulatory cooperation, reciprocal deference is important both for us as a CCP, but also just more generally for the markets from a risk perspective and from an efficiency perspective. So I would say over the last months in particular, as this European process has accelerated towards the finish line, we have engaged, and our understanding is that the same areas of concern, in particular with the ESMA consultations and the way that they've been designed, I think have arisen within the market. But I defer to the market.
Well, I think this is an interesting point. When we ran the working group, our working group had participation from clearing members, end users, and CCPs and exchanges. And the working group actually was run out of Europe, not in the United States. So the main participants in the work were European. We had some Asian participants and some in the United States, but the bulk were European. So the views here in our FIA response are mainly those of European participants. And I think the reason that they reflect a lot of the views you've heard up here is because when they think about CCP regulation, they're also thinking about clearing member, swap dealer, every other regulation that could come down the line. And the thought is we don't want duplicative regulation anywhere, actually. If it's comparable, that should be enough. And so the view we took in our response was how should the regulatory regimes work cross-border in every single space. And that's the view in our response.
Mr. Weejan?
I was just going to try to respond to your question too from a different perspective, that of the cash marketplace. You've heard from other people though earlier today about the appeal of having access to cleared products, and that's true on the cash side too. And so, for whatever it's worth, one of the things that we've encountered or discovered is that we're actually trying to expand access to clearing as much as possible on the cash side. We're doing that through a couple of different products. We call them these sponsored member programs that we're offering to different market participants. But so long as this issue has not been fully resolved, and we've been focusing mainly on Europe and EMIR 2.2, but there are active policy makings in other jurisdictions as well. So wherever this issue is unresolved, what we're finding is that either there's some reluctance on the part of the CCP, or there's some reluctance on the part of these would-be members or sponsored members to the clearinghouse in participating in the program, because no one quite knows what the regulatory impact would be. We had a internal panel last week at our company, and we had a number of firms that are also represented here today, and people are talking about the importance of some of these products that I just mentioned and having access to clearing, especially for repo activity and securities financing and things of that sort. And again, it's just harder to do that. In fact, one of the panelists last week at our internal conference said, we'd like to see these products moved to international participants. We want more sponsor members coming in from outside the U.S. And again, it's difficult to do that when there's not certainty about what the regulatory legal impact of that would be.
Thank you. Ms. Vandendalen?
So just going back to what Commissioner Stump alluded to, is that the G20 was a commitment to review and reform the rules around OTC derivatives. And when EMIR went into effect, we saw that it included both OTC and exchange-traded derivatives. The G20 also called for global standards to be created and followed by regulators and deference to local regulators. And what we've heard as a concern from our members is that EMIR 2.2 is, again, a further extension away from what the G20 originally committed to.
Thank you. Any comments or questions on the phone? All right, great. Well, sorry. Any comments or questions on the phone? Wonderful. Thank you to our final panelists of the day. I also want to just take a moment before we go to some closing statements to thank, first of all, Commissioner Stump for gathering us all here today to talk about two very critical issues in a detailed way, and for also initiating the idea of a subcommittee so we can continue these discussions. I want to thank the chairman, Commissioners Quintens and Benham, for their participation today. Thank Andre for her incredible organizational skills in the midst of another big project she's working on. And thanks to the other staff who were very involved in helping to organize this day. And finally, thank you to our panelists for participating and sharing your insights, and also to our GMAC members. Your perspectives are very, very much appreciated by the Commission as they think through these important issues. Commissioner Stump?
I'll be very brief. For anyone who's had to listen to me speak over the past year, I'm sure I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but we all need to be reminded of how we got here. We've regulated futures for a very long time. We committed to reforms 10 years ago, and I think each time we have this conversation, we need to revisit what we committed to. So in regards to this morning's conversation, the reason that uncleared margin was initiated was to ensure that the interconnectedness of institutions was addressed outside of the clearing space in the event that clearing was not appropriate or sought after, and in addition to encourage clearing. With regard to clearinghouses and the utility that they provide, one of the key reforms was that we would encourage more clearing. We would mandate more clearing. We certainly do not want to set up a situation where regulatory impediments make that more challenging. With that, I would like to thank Angie very much for her tremendous leadership. She gets to do all the hard work when we have these meetings, and I think I benefit from just listening. So thanks so much, Angie. Thanks, Andre, and thanks to all the members and the panelists.
Commissioner Quintens, do you have any closing remarks? So thanks. I will echo everyone's thanks, and this meeting of GMAC now adjourned.